Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. I got a World War III alert. We got a World War III alert. David versus Goliath, the humiliation. Oh, it's so much to go around. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, Trump has wasted billions of dollars. He said he was going to stop the Houthis. He have stopped nothing. He is only getting humiliated along with the Israelis. Let's look at the content. Salute. This is very disturbing. The latest air defense system is in Israel. All of the advanced
footage clearly shows a hypersonic missile fired from Yemen, making a direct impact with a big hit on Ben Gurion.
Let's just slow down. Trump has sent the latest air defense systems, the most advanced air defense systems to Israel to protect them, just in case Iran wanted to attack them. So they got some of the best of the best, so they say, in Israel. Check. Especially protecting Ben Gurion Airport, the biggest airport in Israel, which now airlines are saying no, they can no longer go to Israel. This airport might collapse because it's way too dangerous, what the Houthi revolutionaries just did. But Trump has sent our warships to the Red Sea, saying he was going to destroy the power of the Yemeni rebels. I remember they said they had killed Yemeni's top missile scientist. Well, what the hell? Who fired this off? Is it the second missile scientist? Is they number 2 or number 3 guy? I don't know. But the humiliation for the U.S. destroyers, the U.S. naval fleet, the aircraft carriers that's in the Red Sea. How the hell did this happen? And this is what Yemen is doing to them?
Iranian airport in Tel Aviv, Israel, this afternoon on May 4th, 2025. Footage circulating online shows Ben Gurion Airport taking a crushing blow. Footage from various angles shows the moment the missile hits the ground, evading sophisticated Israeli and U.S. defenses and layers. Essentially, this proves that THAAD and Arrow 3, which are deployed to protect the airport, cannot reliably defend against a single missile launch, even safely bombing Israeli main international airport. Ansar Allah, or Houthi group of Yemen, claimed responsibility for the attack, which did not cause any casualties, and people at the airport saved themselves at the arrival of the missile, as shown in the footage. From the missile impact site, a crater was found near the airport, after the military said it attempted to intercept the missile launched from Yemen. Large chunks of earth were thrown up to 125 meters, and were 25 meters deep. Smaller debris flew up to 400 meters. Yair Hezroni, the head of the Central Police District, pointed to the missile impact. You can see the area right behind us. A crater was formed here, several tens of meters wide, and several tens of meters deep, he said. Flights in and out of Ben Gurion Airport were suspended, Israeli Channel 12 reported. After the missile attack, airlines from Australia, Austria, Germany, and Switzerland began canceling their flights to Israel en masse. Further escalation has clearly demonstrated the great risk to Ben Gurion, and could lead to airlines ceasing operations there until the end of the genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza. Yemen have just attacked Ben Gurion Airport with hypersonic missiles in an attempt to stop the genocide in Gaza, according to a statement by Yemeni Armed Forces spokesman, Brigadier General Yahya Sari. The airport is now closed. We have relieved airlines from operating there. We will continue to support Palestine, regardless of the consequences, Sari stressed.
Now, women playing chess. This chess not checkers. They could have that hypersonic missile, which they can't bring down. It's obvious they can't bring it down. It could have absolutely hit an aircraft carrier, but they don't want an all-out war with America. They want to stop the genocide. But that is a warning to the U.S. also. We can definitely hit your aircraft carrier. You can't stop a hypersonic missile, and we're going to display it by hitting Israel's #1 airport. Have people running for their lives. They gonna lose millions of dollars. That airport probably gonna close down. International flights say they can't be going there. It's not safe. No, it's not safe as long as there's genocide going on. I'm hearing, and YouTube community guidelines. We do not support what's going on with the Yemeni rebels. They are considered a terrorist group by the United States of America.
Right, so the Houthis have struck again, it seems. And by struck, they've beyond doubt struck. They've hit their target this time, as a hypersonic ballistic missile launched from Yemen has struck near Terminal 3 of Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport. And having taken many a shot at this target since the collapse of the Gaza ceasefire by Israel, finding their mark marks a significant turning point in the regional escalation surrounding the war in Gaza and Israel's siege on the Palestinian people, with the Houthis regularly claiming their objectives have been achieved, whilst Israel has consistently reported they intercepted any rockets fired their way. Well, for the first time since the end of that ceasefire, a missile originating from Yemen has definitely managed to bypass Israel's supposed advanced air defense systems, both the long-range Israeli Arrow system and the US-provided THAAD defense system, and caused real physical damage on Israeli territory, injuring 8 civilians and disrupting international air travel. And by saying that international travel to Israel is now unsafe, this time they've definitely proven that. Moreover, it forces a reckoning with the Trump administration's undeclared and increasingly unpopular military campaign in Yemen, one conducted in the name of defending Israel and combating Iranian influence, yet yielding little strategic success and likely increasing American and civilian casualties. I say likely because we don't know. And we don't know because, unlike the Biden administration, the Trump one appears to be determined to cover such figures up and have now been called out for that. Without these, it becomes virtually impossible to assess or critique these ongoing strikes on Yemen. So what has Trump got to hide about them then? Right, so the missile strike on Ben Gurion Airport has properly given Israel a shock, bit of a wake-up call, shaking them out of their arrogance somewhat, because there's no doubt this time that the Houthis did find their mark. A long-range hypersonic missile from Yemen striking one of the most fortified areas of Israeli airspace represents a massive blow to Israel, and it's a big win for the Houthis, now able to say beyond doubt that even where the air defenses are supposedly the strongest in and around Tel Aviv, they can now beat them, and have done. And more to the point, the people living there now know it too. According to reports from multiple outlets, the missile hit close to Terminal 3, the main international terminal.
It's more humiliation for Donald Trump. They said they killed the Yemeni rocket scientists and people that could do this type of stuff. They said he was bragging. We seeing the tweets, the posts. You killed them. You destroyed the Yemenis missile defense and missiles. America's back. All that nonsense, and then look what happened today. All that's proved to be fake. Like Trump said, all that was fake news. What he was saying. It's the real news.
Terminal at Ben Gurion Airport. The attack injured 8 people and temporarily halted all flights, forcing the Israeli government to divert air traffic and prompting at least 6 international airlines, including Lufthansa, British Airways, and Emirates, to suspend their operations to Tel Aviv well into next week at least. The Houthis, of course, claimed responsibility immediately, declaring that the airport was no longer safe for international travel due to Israel's continuing siege of Gaza, something they've said before, but this time they've proven it and proven exactly why. The statement also framed the attack as an act of solidarity with the Palestinian people, as is typical for the group. It is, after all, why they are attacking Israel. Press TV covered the words of Houthi spokesman Yahya Saree in relation to this strike. Yahya Saree, the spokesman for Yemen's armed forces, said in a televised statement that the military operation against the key Israeli airport was conducted with a hypersonic ballistic missile and hit its target successfully. The spokesman pointed out that the results of the operation were the failure of the American and Israeli interceptor systems to repel the projectile, the escape of more than 3 million Zionists to shelters, and the complete cessation of airport traffic for more than an hour. Stressing that the operation was in support of the oppressed Palestinian people and their fighters in Gaza, Saree warned in his statement that Ben Gurion is no longer safe for air navigation. Yemen, its people, leadership, and army will, with Allah's help, continue to stand firm and steadfast in the face of American aggression, never abandoning its religious, moral, and humanitarian duty towards the oppressed Palestinian people, regardless of the consequences, until the aggression on Gaza ceases and the siege is lifted, the spokesman added. For decades, Israel has invested heavily in its missile defense network, boasting systems such as the Iron Dome, which is the best known. Then there's also David's Sling, there are the Arrow systems, and most recently, the US supplied Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD system. They have a lot of different air defense systems. How does anything get through? Well, this hypersonic ballistic missile from Yemen did, fired in the early hours of this morning as it was, and it evaded all of these systems, and major questions will now be being asked about that. As you might expect, therefore, Israel's mad Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, has launched an internal investigation into how the missile bypassed all of its different layers of defenses. Officials are now considering whether the Houthis might have significantly improved their missile technology, possibly with foreign assistance, or whether the current conflict has exposed cracks in Israel's technological armor, so to speak. An ongoing strike prior to the Gaza ceasefire were making clear, with interceptor missile batteries running out of munitions or being destroyed themselves. Is it all now happening again too? Are they running out of munitions, or are the Houthis just getting around them? But Netanyahu and Katz have readily threatened retaliation already, as usual. Benny Gantz of the National Unity Party has chosen to blame Iran for this, arguing that the missile technology and targeting guidance could only have come from Tehran. There's no direct evidence to back up this claim at all. The Houthis are far more autonomous now, arguably, than they have been previously. It's far likelier that these accusations are just part of Israel's ongoing efforts to undermine US-Iran nuclear negotiations, turning every regional flare-up into a pretext to derail that. Israel fearing the US will let Iran continue its nuclear research. No nuclear weapons involved in that whatsoever, as both US and UN inspections have proven. But it's never stopped Israel before, and they won't stop this nonsense now. The US has increasingly become embroiled in Yemen since that Gaza ceasefire fell, of course, especially when the Trump administration launched Operation Rough Rider, seeking to avert more promised Houthi attacks on Israeli shipping using Red Sea shipping lanes and US warships. The campaign has involved hundreds of airstrikes, around 800 of them to date, and the deployment of US naval assets as well, including the USS Harry S. Truman in the Red Sea, and now joined by the USS Carl Vinson in the Gulf of Aden. Despite the scale of these operations and how many they have carried out, they have failed to make any significant impact on Houthi capabilities whatsoever. No matter what they do, Israel is still getting targeted for missile strikes. Attacks on both Israeli and American targets have also continued unabated, with the most recent strikes prior to that hit on Ben Gurion Airport seeing the Truman having to make such evasive maneuvers it ended up tossing an F-18 jet and its towing tractor straight into the sea, all before running off northwards, which sparked a bit of a debate as to whether the Truman itself had actually been hit. In response to that, however, the Pentagon has ordered the Truman to remain stationed in the Red Sea, so hurt or not, crippled or not, they're staying. That order, however, rather disturbingly, came a day after reports came out about US casualty figures from the public in relation to its undeclared, not at all ratified, de facto war on the Houthis. Because officials from CENTCOM, the office of the Secretary of Signalgate, but supposedly a defense beat Hegseth, and the White House itself have all refused to disclose how many American service members have been killed or injured since March, when Operation Rough Rider began. Now, goodness knows we can criticize the administration of genocide Joe Biden for being just as trigger happy in the Middle East in defending Israel as Trump is being. This kind of information was always readily available and regularly released under his administration. So what's the deal with Donald Trump then? The lack of accountability has already drawn criticism from veterans groups and members of Congress, as well as alternative and independent media asking these same questions. Without clear data, it becomes nearly impossible to assess the cost of the war, let alone hold decision makers accountable for the choices they have been making. And this not only undermines democracy, but also risks repeating the failures of past US military interventions in the Middle East, notably against Yemen, where they have always failed. And it really ought to have more people questioning exactly how bad are matters here, that the US government are continuing with unabated, for no benefit to the American people at all, just for Israel, this fight, a nation which more than 53% of Americans are no longer even supportive of. So in addition to the shady behind closed doors decision making of little Donny, the UK has now rejoined the fray against the Houthis too, conducting airstrikes against Houthi positions and what it claims are targeted precision operations. The Royal Air Force's involvement has now been confirmed, therefore, once again, since the Gaza ceasefire fell. But there seems to be more to come. It seems perhaps the aforementioned signal gate bungling that had J.D. Vance referring to Europe as pathetic for not fighting with them for Israel, and had Hegseth apparently snarling that Europe were freeloading on the US, might have stirred Keir Starmer into jumping to Trump's fiddle all the more. After all, when the UK was being threatened by Trump over tariffs, we saw Keir Starmer seeking to placate him with tax cuts for US tech giants being offered up instead of standing up to him. Now these insults against Europe have come out. Here comes the aircraft carrier HMS Prince of Wales, now en route to the Red Sea as part of Carrier Strike Group 25. Officially, this deployment is a routine exercise. However, many observers, and particularly those in Yemen, see it as an escalation and a reinforcement of the Western military access alongside the US and Israel. The Houthis have responded forcefully to the UK's actions from the airstrikes that have just happened, along with this strike group that's on the way, in a statement released after the latest wave of UK airstrikes. Houthi leadership warning that the United Kingdom would now be treated as part of a trio of evil, along with the United States and Israel. Nobody in the UK voted to be called that. Starmer can always, of course, find money for war like every other warmongering Western leader we can't see the back of fast enough, especially if it implies servitude and acquiescence to Donald Trump all on top of that. Since October 2023, over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed by the official figures, so the likely true figure could be 4 times that. Gaza has been razed north to south, as we know. Gaza remains under a total blockade, with aid trucks denied entry. Starvation now being used as a weapon. Images of starving children and flattened neighborhoods have circulated worldwide, fueling the outrage so many of us feel. And it is for this reason the Houthis are doing what they're doing, lest we forget. So military strikes against them to preserve the interests of the nation inflicting all this misery, something ordinary people, normal thinking people, are simply not just going to accept, not from our leaders or from anyone else. The Israeli government strategy is one of total siege, aimed at forcing a complete surrender from Hamas at the indiscriminate expense of many innocent Palestinian lives as it takes. And even if they got what they wanted, they wouldn't stop here, because they want the whole Gaza Strip. The whole point of the war has nothing to do with hostages either, and more to do with keeping Benjamin Netanyahu in post. And our leaders just keep supporting that aim. Their attacks, their actions are to support keeping him in power. Because that is Israel's aim right now, and they back Israel no matter what. By shifting blame to Iran, Israel just seeks to keep on doing what it has done for decades, to gain advantage, and that is destabilize the Middle East. Without evidence, all their narrative, believed unquestioningly as it always is, and publicized rampantly by pliant media, does it seek to justify further military action and obstruct those US-Iran nuclear talks. The longer this continues, the greater the risk of a broader regional war. The Houthi missile strike on Ben Gurion airport ought to come as a massive warning. Instead, Israeli arrogance and slavish Western loyalty will just see matters doubled down on in all likelihood. But the same ongoing failure to make any difference, costing lives in Yemen and costing American lives that it seems the US are no longer prepared to publicize, which should be alarming to the American people. Why else keep the numbers secret is my line of thinking here. The United States and its allies are entangled in a regional conflict with no clear end, no measurable success, and an alarming lack of transparency. Civilian casualties are mounting in Yemen, certainly, but US service members may be getting injured or dying without acknowledgement or public knowledge. Israel continues its war in Gaza with impunity, blocking humanitarian aid and using the cover of war to pursue its own interests, and only the Houthis seem prepared to do something about that. The Trump administration must be compelled to disclose casualty figures. Congress must assert itself and demand oversight over Operation Rough Rider. American people should be lobbying their representatives to that effect too. We here in the UK must do likewise, as Starmer's obsession with military participation, his boot-licking approach to dealing with Trump, and his support for Israel without equivocation don't serve any sense of national interest here either, and all merely perpetuates Tony Blair-style adventurism with the US. We all know where that led last time. And Israel must be held to account for genocide, as well as its efforts to drag the region into even wider conflict. Meanwhile, in what Israel had been caught out in strikes on a ship carrying aid to Gaza, seeking to break their blockade, they did so from Maltese airspace, just off the Maltese coast, some 2,000 kilometers away from Gaza. Get all the details of that depraved attack, carried out as it would appear with assistance from Malta, in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of supporting the channel.
What is so special about this missile? What happened? Well, Ansarullah have been conducting attacks against Israel. Yeah, of course, many of them landed. Israel, however, did intercept some, and they did show images and videos of interception coming against the missiles that are being launched from Yemen. So what exactly happened this time? Well, there was one interesting report coming from Yemen, from Al-Mayadeen correspondent in Yemen, in Sana'a, saying that there's actually something behind this missile that made it succeed. What is it exactly? Well, Ansarullah are not saying exactly which missile they used this time. So it's usually they declare it's a Palestine 2 hypersonic missile or a Dhul Faqar hypersonic missile. This time they did not declare, but the correspondent from Yemen said that they did launch a missile, but this missile, it was actually a developed missile. Okay, saying that the Yemeni army has developed its missile and strategic weapons, making them capable of bypassing radar systems, and has also developed air defense weapons. It's just that the armed forces in Yemen continue to develop hypersonic missiles, both quantitatively and qualitatively, as well as the naval weapons and drones, despite the aggression, meaning that this is a modified missile. This is a modified missile coming from Yemen, and despite the continued aggression against them from the United States and the genocide cartel, for them standing up against a genocidal entity committing war crimes with a wanted war criminal leading the country, and more war criminals, by the way, are due to come on the list now. The ICC is preparing a new list of people to be added to the war criminal list who would be wanted internationally. The United States did not stop them, not only from continuing the attacks, but from developing new weapons, from modifying their existing arsenal, and from modifying new weapons to go and attack Israel. How is Iran linked to all of this? Israel is saying that Iran has a direct involvement in these attacks. How? According to a report in Israel, they're saying that this has been a maneuver by Iran. This attack was a maneuver by Iran. So we have this report in the Israeli Ma'arif saying the direct hit on Ben Gurion airport, Iran's maneuver against Israel has now been revealed. They're saying the Air Force has launched a comprehensive investigation with the aim of trying to understand how the air defense system failed this morning to intercept the missile launched from Yemen, and the fall was detected at Ben Gurion airport. So according to this report, they are conducting an investigation, but they're linking it already to Iran. They're saying that we tried to intercept it with Arrow 3 and with the THAAD missile system. They didn't say if they used David's Sling or the Iron Dome, because usually Israel has a multi-layered air defense system that is activated based on what they're attacked with. Anything hypersonic or exoatmospheric, Arrow 3 begins, then the THAAD, closer to the Israeli airspace, something that is much closer to the land, Iron Dome, because Iron Dome is usually developed to intercept short-range missiles, primarily from Gaza and from Lebanon. This is the main purpose behind its development. So Israel has a multi-layered air defense system, like many countries across the world. Yes, despite this multi-layered air defense system, it failed miserably. Now, according to this report in Israel, they're saying that these missiles missed the target. They said an American system, an Arrow 3, millions. An Arrow 3, $2 to $3 million, one missile. That's it. And we're not talking about the activation and time and stuff, and we're not talking about that yet. They're saying that, the Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center, named after Major General Meir Amit, saying that the Houthis, they're quoting him, have Quds 2 and Quds 3 missiles, which have effective ranges of between 1,300 to 2,000 kilometers and could effectively hit targets in Israel, which is more than 1,500 kilometers away from Yemen. And Joshua Kaliski, an INCC researcher, he, according to that report, previously published an article about the Houthi capabilities. And the fact that their missiles ranging from 1,600 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers are actually the advanced Iranian Shihab 3 missile, which has a range of 2,000 kilometers, and also the Burkan 3 with a range of approximately 1,200 kilometers. He's also adding the Sumar cruise missile in its various versions with a range of 2,000 kilometers and a warhead of half a ton. Another cruise missile, according to that report, with a shorter range is Quds 2, and the Samad 4 attack drone with 2,500 kilometers with a warhead of 45 kilograms. This is saying that, well, Iran is directly involved. They're adding in this article that this is a signal to the Americans and Israel regarding the possibility of an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities if negotiations between the Americans and Iran run aground and they do not work and fail. So Israel's already tying it with Iran. Could there be a link to Iran? Yes, there could be a link to Iran, of course. How? Well, Iran has been one of the main countries supporting Ansarullah. Of course, they're independent at the end of the day. They develop their own stuff too, but they are backed by Iran. They are supported undeniably by Iran, despite them having full independence. As a matter of fact, their whole political positions and constant responses to the Israeli terror inside of Gaza has been independent, an independent move coming from them that hasn't been similar to other groups or other countries. This is a position coming from the Yemeni people and the Yemeni leadership and the Yemeni armed forces, and they are paying the price because of this. Now, Israel is tying this to Iran because of the link. There is an undeniable link. And does Iran have a reason to push Ansarullah for more successful attacks against Israel? Perhaps. How? Well, Israel has been a country that constantly tries to hinder the prospect of reaching a deal between the United States and Iran. There were 3 rounds of talks between the United States and Iran, talks about positivity. Donald Trump himself saying that he outright prefers the diplomatic approach and having a deal rather than having a no deal, and having war with Iran. And he previously made certain statements that didn't make Benjamin Netanyahu very happy. Iran also had very suspicious attacks in the past few days. The attack in Bandar Abbas area, there was also a suspicious attack happening yesterday inside of Iran. Iran could potentially be viewing this as a retaliation or acts of sabotage coming from Israel to try and hinder the prospect of reaching a deal with the United States administration. A deal that the United States is now seeking after it unilaterally withdrew from in the first term of Donald Trump. Why? Because of Israeli pressure, the same pressure coming from Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel doesn't want the United States to have a deal with Iran. However, they're already preparing that the United States might have a deal with Iran. Research centers in Israel and senior ministers in the government have been briefed several days back that the likelihood of the United States getting a deal with Iran about its nuclear program are more likely than a no deal. So Israel wants to hinder that. Therefore, it might be the side behind these attacks. One Iranian parliament member, he said that Israel is behind them because there were 4 explosions in the port, and the attacks yesterday, they're still fresh. But Israel has done and conducted certain acts of aggression and terror and sabotage against Iran. So this is showing that if Iran wants to indeed support, they have the capacity. Hegseth, the United States Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, 2 days ago, he said he actually warned Iran. So he's taking a position like, unlike those who are negotiating, he's saying, we're seeing what you're doing with Yemen. We're seeing what you're doing with Yemen. Have they observed any recent movements coming between Iran and Yemen that led to a very successful attack on the gate of Israel to the world, which is the Ben Gurion? Ben Gurion Airport is the main airport for Israel. Most of the flights happen from Ben Gurion. The alternative ones in the north and south, they don't have the same capacity. And it's important to note that Ben Gurion Airport and the Tel Aviv area that includes the Kiryat, the main hub from which Israel's crimes are managed, the security establishment and the political establishment, it has the most advanced air defense system. It has the most advanced layer of defense in the whole of Israel because of its sensitivity. Therefore, it has the most batteries, the most resources, the most missiles available, the most backup plans that are happening. Yet, despite all of that, Ansarullah are going and attacking. Now, this could be directly an attack coming from Yemen that somehow succeeded this time because of their modification. So there is a chance that it's totally not linked with Iran. However, the Israelis are trying to link it to Iran because they always want to escalate the tensions further, especially between the United States and Iran too. What is Israel going to do about all of that? Trump told them before, leave Yemen to me. Your people don't have to pay. The Americans will pay. The American taxpayer will pay to go and attack a country that is taking action against a genocidal entity and fulfilling its international legal obligations. Of course, they wouldn't use this terminology because they're on the wrong side of history. They have been and still are for a very long time. But Donald Trump told Israel, don't attack Yemen, leave Yemen on me. We have seen more attacks coming from the United States against Yemen, far more than during the days of Joe Biden. And Donald Trump, indeed, made very significant threats against Yemen. And Israel adhered to the demand of the United States not to attack Yemen now because the United States is leading that front, and therefore there is no need. I mean, from an Israeli perspective, they're all saying, well, America's doing this on our behalf. They have more resources, more capabilities. And from our perspective, it's a very long journey that is full of risks. 2,000 kilometers to fly over the Red Sea to go and attack Yemen when the United States is already there. Struggling, but it's already there. Now, Israel now is changing the tone slightly. So they're saying that, no, we actually need to take action now. The red line has been crossed, and Israel is considering breaking the rules against the Houthis. They're saying in this report here, Ma'arif, Israel is considering a change in policy towards the Houthis after a missile launched from Yemen. Al-Bukhaiti threatens escalation and warns we have painful targets in Israel. The defense establishment believes that this is a response to American pressure. So they know that the more the United States escalates with Yemen, the more likely it is for Yemen to escalate against Israel, not just the American forces in the Red Sea killing innocent Yemenis with these constant attacks and trying to whitewash them by saying that we targeted the Houthi targets above the ground. But from an Israeli perspective, they don't want to be viewed as a side who constantly gets a beating and are not responding and having someone on their behalf attacking. Why? Because Israel's trying to create the perception that they are the be-all and end-all. They are the ones who make the decisions. They are the ones who can go and attack everywhere in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Syria, and no one retaliates. Yemen is the only country outside of Gaza now, the only side outside of Gaza, raising the flag of resistance and challenging Israel despite all of the pressure, due to various reasons, of course, the nature of the Yemeni people, their faith, their belief, their moral positioning, and their absolute fearlessness. These people are totally fearless, and nothing puts them away. I mean, we saw some of the attacks that the United States has been conducting against Yemen. Now the Yemeni people take it. It's as if nothing's happening. It's as if a fly is flying when a half-a-ton bomb is landing next to these people. But from an Israeli perspective, that bothers them. Why? Because it's like a small, not a small really, a very significant challenge, constantly poking Israel and showing them, no, it's not what you're portraying yourself to be. If other countries choose not to retaliate against your terror in their lands for their own reasons, we're not going to be that side. And guess what? We're not going to be that side, and we're going to prove to the whole world that it's effective. And this is what they've done. The Red Sea is a red zone for anything linked to Israel. The Eilat port bankruptcy from over a year ago. Now they are escalating to a level where they're trying to impose a blockade on Israeli airspace effectively. Again, it's working. Israel, with all the censorship that's happening in Israel, is confirming that this missile landed, a modified missile, and they're trying to say that, oh yeah, we need to respond now. What can they do? This is the question here. Will Israel go and attack Yemen? What can they do? And is there a prospect of stopping the Yemeni attacks? Well, number one, let's start with the prospect of stopping the Yemeni attacks. It isn't going to happen. Gaza and Yemen are very similar in a sense of these people have suffered so much. Yemen, coming out from wars, from poverty, from famine, and likewise in Gaza, under Israeli occupation and terror and blockade and displacement for almost a century, right? Mainly after 1948, more so after 1967, moving on from 1987 post the initial uprising, the Palestinian Intifada, the first one, that started from Gaza because an Israeli decided to run over people, and they just had enough and started throwing stones on the Israeli occupying forces. This is where it started. These people, 73% of the population are refugees. The situation has been catastrophic way before October the 7th. Yemen and Gaza, they have a similar mindset in a sense of they're willing to take that sacrifice, and they don't have other justifications that they prioritize before their humanitarian and religious and national duties towards their people. So they're not really calculating, oh, if we attack, we might have some blockade, we might have sanctions, they might attack our economic interests, they want to drag us into the war so that they can occupy. They do not follow this type of argument. They're way beyond this argument in Yemen. So you've had the United States with the most advanced fleets on earth going there only to prove how much of a paper tiger it is. 4 American aircraft carriers expelled from the Red Sea by attacks from the same people who are wearing flip-flops and doing whatever they can to attack them, to deter them. They weren't threatening the United States, by the way. Yemen. Yemen are not threatening anyone, by the way. This is what they want you to believe. This is the perception that they're trying to brainwash the people with. Oh, Yemen, and the British Secretary of Defense the other day saying, oh, we need to go and protect security and freedom. Security and freedom for who? For people to murder children in Gaza. Continue the sentence. They're trying to hide the fact, their abhorrent position of going to Yemen only for the sake of Israel. Burning taxpayers' money, burning money they can spend internally on people with need, people who are desperate, people hardly making ends meet, recessions in many countries without any declaration, so that they can maybe, make it pass as if there's nothing happening, economical disasters. But they have money. They have millions. They have hundreds of millions and billions to go and spend for the sake of a genocidal war criminal entity. Therefore, what is Israel going to do? If the United States is failing with its attacks in Yemen, what is Israel going to do? Are they going to go and conduct another show that will cause a lot of fire, attack another oil field or something, so something can explode and burn and show the whole, oh, look, we're burning? Are they going to kill thousands of innocent children and women? And do they think that by doing that they will be? They haven't been deterred for years of conspiracies against the Yemeni people and regional and international coalitions against these poor people in Yemen, who are bravely standing up now for Gaza, because of their do so. Even if Israel wants to carry out attack, it's not going to be effective. But the main question of Israel, before they actually make a decision whether they respond to Yemen or not, will be if the United States gives the blessing. Because believe it or not, there's still some difference here and there between the administration in the US and Israel. As a matter of fact, there's an internal conflict in the US administration, especially with the more hardline Zionist lobby. And internally, Donald Trump had to make certain changes. Now, if the United States says, well, no, you can't do anything about that, and we are still in our position, don't attack Yemen, we are taking care of Yemen, clearly ineffective, then Israel would have to sit there and do nothing and show itself in a very humiliating manner. The other option is Trump might tell them, fine, have a symbolic attack. They might kill some innocent people or have a very large explosion to try and show that we still have some sort of presence. Both ways, this will not be stopping the Yemeni people. What will stop the Yemeni people is, like they said many times, stopping the genocide in Gaza and lifting the siege of the Gaza Strip.
Years, the US and the UK military have been dropping tons of powerful bombs, killing countless civilians in Yemen. And every time they committed these war crimes, they justified their criminal act by claiming to degrade the military capabilities of the Houthi rebels or Ansarullah fighters. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer only last week, proudly took to the podium in Parliament to flaunt his country's military strikes on Yemen using the same nonsense, that the criminal act was to degrade the military capabilities of the Houthi fighters. I use the term criminal act because past evidence has shown that these military strikes have often hit civilian targets rather than the Houthi rebels or their military installations. Remember this attack by the US that killed tribal Yemeni civilians? You can watch this video here. And the fact that Houthis have once again managed to fire supersonic ballistic missiles targeting the Israeli airport shows that both the US and the UK have been hitting the wrong targets up until now. In other words, they have been lying to us. And barely a few days later, the Houthis have heaped embarrassment on the so-called powerful nations of the West by directly attacking Ben Gurion airport in Israel using a supersonic ballistic missile. I use the word embarrassment primarily for two reasons. First, the missile fired by Houthis could not be detected by the so-called Iron Dome provided by the US using American taxpayers' money. Just see what US media outlet, pro-Israeli US media outlet, CNN wrote. Its headline read, and I quote, Israel fails to intercept Houthi missile targeting its main airport, showing the limits of US efforts to weaken the group. End quote. And secondly, this comes as a slap on the faces of Trump and Starmer, who proudly justified their war crimes only last week. Isn't it amazing that even the pro-Israeli CNN realizes, and they get it, that the US and the UK have made a fool of themselves and their citizens for these many years by making wrong claims? And yet, this Starmer chap was telling us in the parliament last week this.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday evening, Royal Air Force Typhoons successfully conducted strikes against Houthi military targets in Yemen in a joint operation with our US allies. This action was in line with long-standing policy of the UK government to defend freedom of navigation in the Red Sea after Houthi attacks fuel regional instability and risk economic security for families in the UK. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that all UK aircraft and personnel returned safely, and I pay tribute to the professionalism and bravery of all our servicemen and servicewomen. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Speaker, is making a statement immediately after PMQs.
Clip. Houthis took to social media to add insult to injury to Israelis and their Western backers. Its military spokesperson warned airline companies to stop their businesses in Israel and issued a chilling warning to Israeli backers.
نفذت القوة الصاروخية في القوات المسلحة اليمنية عملية عسكرية نوعية استهدفت مطار بن غوريون في منطقة يافا المحتلة، وذلك بصاروخ باليستي فرط صوتي، وقد أصاب هدفه بنجاح بفضل الله. وكان من نتائج العملية ما يلي: فشل المنظومات الاعتراضية الأمريكية والإسرائيلية في اعتراضه، هروب أكثر من 3 ملايين صهيوني إلى الملاجئ، توقف حركة المطار بشكل كامل ولأكثر من ساعة. وبهذا تجدد القوات المسلحة اليمنية تحذيرها لكافة شركات الطيران العالمية من مواصلة رحلاتها إلى مطار بن غوريون، كونه أصبح غير آمن لحركة الملاحة. وفي وقت سابق مساء أمس نفذ سلاح الجو المسير عملية عسكرية استهدفت هدفا حيويا تابعا للعدو الإسرائيلي في منطقة عسقلان المحتلة، وذلك بطائرة مسيرة نوع يافا. سيواصل اليمن شعبا وقيادة وجيشا بعون الله وبالتوكل عليه والثقة بنصره والثبات والصمود في مواجهة العدوان الأمريكي، وعدم التخلي عن أداء الواجب الديني والأخلاقي والإنساني تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني المظلوم مهما كانت التداعيات.
And how did war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu react? By repeating the same old nonsense that we will strike back. Yes, strike back by killing more civilians.
לגבי האיום החותי, הרבה אזרחים בישראל מודאגים מהנושא הזה, מה יש לך לספר?
אנחנו פועלים נגדם. פעלנו בעבר, נפעל גם בעתיד, אני לא יכול לפרט את כל הדברים. ארצות הברית גם בתיאום איתנו פועלת גם נגדם. זה לא זבנג וגמרנו, אבל יהיו זבנגים.
I told you earlier, these are cowards. They are good at killing only innocent people, starving children and babies to death. That's the real strength of these Western leaders and their settler colony project called Israel. Every time they carry out slaughtering of more innocent people, it's either to distract the public from their failures on the domestic front, or just to bolster their terrorist friends in the settler colony of Israel. Or else, how do you justify the shameful silence and inaction of these Western leaders on the unfolding of a genocide of over 2 million people in real time in 2025? Social media is replete with videos of children literally suffering. Their parents are posting desperate messages. I can't even see those videos because I'm helpless. I wish I could be of any help to them. I wish I could feed all those children. Do you realize what it is, what it feels like not having food? Not just for one day, not just for 1 week, not just for 1 month. It's been more than 2 months. These evil Israeli terrorists, they have maintained the complete blockade of over 2 million people. Anyway, coming back to the Houthi missile attack targeting the Ben Gurion airport was so powerful that even people at the airport, they felt the shock. Just watch this clip.
Let's bring in our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, who's in Jerusalem for us. Pretty unusual, Alistair, isn't it, for missiles to successfully attack Ben Gurion?
Yeah, I mean, this is deeply worrying for Israel, and this has happened too close to home, as it were. The fact that a missile fired from Yemen has not only managed to evade Israel's missile defense system for ballistic missiles, the Arrow system, but also a US anti-missile battery, the THAAD system, and then land very close to the country's international airport. I mean, you know, a few more 100 meters to the north, and it would have been right in and amongst the airport itself. So it really concerning for Israel, and we have seen the impact that's had very, very quickly. I mean, a lot of international airlines, British Airways, US carriers, the Lufthansa group as well, all suspending their flights for a number of days. Again, it's been very much on and off with international carriers coming to and from Israel over the last year and a half because of the ongoing war. And that is the impact that the Houthis are having. And really, you know, from a Houthi point of view, it's a pretty simple but effective tactic. I mean, they laid it out a couple of months ago. They said, we will continue to target Ben Gurion Airport. And so they have done so. And all they need is to be successful once. And I think you could argue that today's strike against Israel was, you know, successful in a sense, because it has led to that reaction from international airlines. And that then has a major impact on foreign travel in and out of Israel and the economy and so on and so on. So, you know, the Houthis are continuing to target Israel. They say it is in response to the ongoing war in Gaza. We've seen in return, particularly the Americans, but also actually the British in the past week, carrying out airstrikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. I suspect the Israelis will now carry out their own strikes, possibly tonight, possibly in the coming days. Benjamin Netanyahu has said that there will be a reaction. And so, you know, it is posing a real threat to this country. And I think a lot of Israelis, I mean, you know, I heard the explosion of the impact up here in Jerusalem. I heard it as we were having breakfast this morning, you know, and that will have reverberated around tens of thousands of homes around central Israel. So it is very, very worrying that this missile managed to get through what is generally considered to be very sophisticated air defenses.
I've added more clips on the Telegram channel since I can't share them here. You can go to my Telegram channel. Details are on the screen. The Houthis have long said that they are targeting ships linked to Israel in the Red Sea to stop its genocidal campaign in Gaza. They said that they had stopped their military campaign in the Red Sea when the bloodthirsty terrorist Netanyahu agreed to stop his evil act in Gaza in January this year by agreeing for a ceasefire. However, the Houthis said that they only resumed their action in the Red Sea after Netanyahu violated the ceasefire. It's not that difficult to end this cycle of violence, in my opinion, cycle of madness. Instead of helping a terrorist called Netanyahu to carry out the daily slaughtering of 100 babies, The UK and the US should use their power to end the genocide in Gaza. Make Israel pay for its war crimes and rebuilding of Gaza. Give Palestinians their own country and help them return to their homeland wherever they were uprooted from since 1948. It's not a rocket science to find a solution unless your only objective is to kill innocent people for fun, just because you are evil. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and pay.
Well, it's not looking like war any longer between the United States and Iran. The statement by Donald Trump this afternoon that he was quite content with Iran retaining its civil nuclear industry, on the face of it, brings this crisis to an end because, against my advice, Iran is very clear that it doesn't want to have a nuclear weapon. There's a religious fatwa against nuclear weapons, and it continues to stand. So if Iran isn't going to build a nuclear weapon, and Trump is quite happy with Iran's civil nuclear power potential, that's the end of the crisis, isn't it? Well, you would have thought so, much to the disappointment of the leader writers in England today who were salivating for war. I've seen this movie before. I've been in the Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair era when the newspapers were all baying as one, when the television commentators were all baying as one for a new demon, for a new enemy, for a new other. Iran is not at all like what you've been told it is like. Today, I hope we've got some footage of it later. Gayatri and I visited the Armenian Christian Cathedral, where a significant number of worshippers were inside the church, as if in Armenia or as if in any civilized part of the world where other people's religions are respected and cherished. After the cathedral, we went to the synagogue. Yes, you heard that right. We went to one of 100 working, practicing synagogues in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The synagogue we went to also has a museum of Jewish life attached to it. There was not one single guard, not one guard on the synagogue, because there is no need for any guards on the synagogue. Jewish people here, Christian people here are cherished and respected members of the community. They are part of a mosaic, which is what Iran is, of multiple faiths, nationalities, ethnicities, and different creeds. Iran is a peaceful place where outside this studio in Tehran, life goes on as normal. Couples walk around. The famous hijab edict seems no longer to exist. Iran is a serene place, a beautiful place, an historic place, the capital of a country which has thousands of years of civilization, unlike some of those who threaten it regularly. Iran was a powerful and global civilizational force when the British were living in the forest and painting their faces blue. And of course, it was a global civilizational force before the United States had been discovered by the European settlers, before the genocide of its original inhabitants, before the importation of tens of millions of slaves into the subcontinent, the United States of America, as it became when it was still a British colony. Iran is a significant place, a civilization that is historically significant and quite different to that which you have been told. If Trump has pulled out of the course of war, which would appear to be true following his U-turn, as it's being described in the American media, I congratulate him for that. The position I held and hold still is that there's no reason why Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon when Israel and America are threatening it with nuclear weapons. But the Iranians don't buy that. They are absolutely consistent with the religious edict that nuclear weapons are forbidden for religious reasons. So I'm hoping that this will not be the last time that I can broadcast to you from Iran, and that we will not be caught up in a war. But it's not just the leader writers in London that will be disappointed by Donald Trump's U-turn today. The settler state of Benjamin Netanyahu is already busy with petty acts of terrorism. The Iranians never acknowledge that it was Iran what done it, because if they did, they would have to respond. And if they responded, Israel would have its way in dragging the United States into a worldwide conflagration. Because, of course, if a war begins, it will not end in Iran. It will consume the entire Persian Gulf region. It will consume the waterways around the Persian Gulf. It will end the production of oil and gas in the American satrapies around the Persian Gulf. It will destroy and wreck the whole Western economy. It will end industry in Western Europe and in much of North America. So Israel wants Iran to respond to these petty acts of terrorism, blowing up a motorcycle factory, for God's sake, blowing up an ordinary power plant, not a nuclear power plant, an ordinary power plant supplying west of Tehran's electricity. Just last night, the motorcycle factory, just in the last hour. Netanyahu is spitting mad at Donald Trump's refusal so far to be drawn into all-out war with Iran. Because if I can do the sums, and I left school at 16 and went to work on a factory floor, if I know the consequences of all-out war with Iran, you can be sure that in the Oval Office, dwarfish as it often seems at times, especially when they publish White House memes of Donald Trump dressed up as the Pope, how disrespectful was that, when the Vatican's still in mourning and when the conclave hasn't yet sat down to pick his successor. In a period of national mourning, there was Donald Trump on the White House Twitter feed, dressed up, mitre, crook, and all, as the next pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church. But as I quipped on Wednesday, he can't be the Pope because he's an orange man. And if you come from my part of the world, you know that that is a disqualification. The bicycle factory is a smoking ruin, as I said, but not quite as much of a smoking ruin as Keir Starmer's Labour government. The Conservatives lost almost 70% of their council seats that they contested on Thursday in the local council elections in England, but Labour lost 80% of their seats. 80%! If they went into the election with 100 councillors, they had 20 left standing at the end, and many of them won by 1 vote, 5 votes. I hope they ask for a recount, because I've got some experience of Labour councils counting election votes. Keir Starmer said in response that he gets it and that he intends to continue in the same direction that he's been travelling in for the last 10 months, but harder and faster. He will have lots of time to reflect and regret that particular turn of phrase. Keir Starmer is the most unpopular prime minister in British political history. Now, there's a lot of contenders for that. There's Liz Truss, who didn't last as long as a lettuce on Lidl's shelf in the greengrocery section. There's Tony Blair himself, who set the world on fire. There's Margaret Thatcher, who destroyed so much of Britain as a society and as an industrial power. There are lots of contenders for the crown of the worst ever British Prime Minister. But Keir Starmer wins it hands down. He is the most universally reviled individual in the whole of the British Isles. Everybody hates him for different reasons, but they all hate him. Some hate him because he was absolutely complicit in the mass murder of women and children and men in occupied Palestine, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. There's millions hate him for that reason. There are others, and if you were drawing a Venn diagram, these circles don't all overlap. There are millions who hate him because he's given tens of billions of British public money to the little dictator Zelensky to sniff up his hooter as old age pensioners in Britain shiver through a cold winter without their cold weather payments that were withdrawn by a Labour government. An accusation which, by the way, he used to regularly make. I saw him do it. I saw his lips move. He used to accuse the Conservatives, you're going to take away our old age pensioners' cold weather payments. They didn't, but he did. Keir Starmer has given £13 billion of our money to Zelensky, whilst claiming that he has to cut the pensioners' allowance because we've got a £22 billion black hole. That was a lie. There is no black hole. There is no 22 billion black hole. There's no black hole at all. The only black hole is that which is left by his looting of our country to give away to Ukraine for a war that need never have started, that the British were completely complicit in starting and keeping going and expanding into Russian territory itself. But that's not the end of his crimes. Britain's only oil refinery, yes, that's right, our only oil refinery closed today. We are an oil-producing country without our own oil refinery. I feel particularly strongly about it. It's in my own country of Scotland. It closed today, and the Labour government didn't lift one finger to keep it open. So we are probably the only major oil-producing country in the world that cannot refine our own product. Mind you, the net zero greenery, quackery and wokery of the Keir Starmer government is such that we've actually shut down many of our oil wells, only to buy oil from Norway, which shares the same oil fields as us in the North Sea. Just like we shut down our coal industry, only to import coal all the way from Australia. How green is that? Importing coal, transporting it from down under all the way to Britain to keep what's left of our industry going. He closed our only steel plant. Yes, the country that invented the Industrial Revolution now produces no steel. No oil, no refinery, no steel, but Keir Starmer's forever threatening Russia with war. Work that out. How you can be a military power with virtually no ships. We've got 8 warships at sea right now. That's the whole of the Royal Navy, which once ruled the waves. No steel, no ships, no refinery. We've got neither the money nor the men. By jingo, if we do manage to provoke war with Russia, we'll be wiped out in 24 hours. But that doesn't stop Starmer continuing to mount the provocations. But I could go to domestic as well as international issues. Starmer, who has been deeply complicit in the slaughter in Gaza, is now murdering Yemenis. I've told you this story before. When I was a teenager, 14 years old, when the Beatles were still top of the hit parade, British soldiers were murdering Yemenis in the Crater district in the city of Aden. Last night, Keir Starmer, not as a proxy, not for somebody else, but on your behalf, using your Air Force and your taxes, Keir Starmer murdered a now new and as yet undetermined number of Yemenis. Why? Because Yemen is the only country in the entire world which is insisting on implementing its international legal obligation to do everything it can to stop the genocide in Gaza. That's what they are bombing the poorest country in the world for. That's what they are bombing and killing Yemenis, men, women, and children for, to defend Israel. So on the economic front and on the foreign policy front, Keir Starmer has been found out. Now, the big winner was the national populist right-wing party Reform, led by Nigel Farage. By some distance, the most popular political leader in the country. For those not in Britain, let me paint a pen portrait of him. He's like Le Pen, he's like the leader of the AFD, he's like Meloni, he's like Georgescu or now Simeon in Romania. He talks the right-wing populist national language. He says he's against globalism. He says he's against the WEF. He used to say he was against NATO, but no longer. He's a big supporter of Keir Starmer's policy towards the Russia-Ukraine war. And like all the others, he's a big supporter of Israel's slaughter of the Palestinians too. So not quite the anti-establishment cove rogue that he pretends to be. But he opposes the taking away of the pensioners' allowance. He opposes the closure of the oil refinery. He stands up for the protection of British steel. He talks the right talk on certain domestic issues. And in particular, he wants everybody to believe that the number one problem in Britain today is the presence of 15% of the population whose faces are a different color to mine. Now, make no mistake, this show, me, my party, the Workers' Party of Britain, we oppose mass immigration because we're the Workers' Party. We stand up for the rights and the standards of living of the working class people who are already in Britain, whatever color they are. We're opposed to mass immigration. And it's obvious that we, like any sentient being, is completely opposed to illegal immigration of hundreds of people every day, almost all of them men, almost all of them young men with no families with them, landing illicitly, illegally on our beaches. We don't believe in open borders. I don't believe in open borders. I never have believed in open borders. Only liberals and Trotskyites, anarchists, and very, very, very rich men believe in open borders because it drives wages down, because it provides a vast pool of reserve labor, a reserve army of labor. We oppose it. But we don't try to pretend that the reason the steel industry closed was because of people with dark faces who arrived on the beach at Dover. We don't try to pretend that the oil refinery closed, that the economy crashed in 2008, that the COVID madness devastated our entire economy and society in 2020, 21, 22. We don't blame people of color. And moreover, we say quite clearly, just because someone has a dark face, it doesn't make them an immigrant. It certainly does not make them an illegal immigrant. And if you foster an atmosphere in the country where all three of these terms become synonymous one with the other, where everyone with a dark face is an immigrant and maybe an illegal immigrant, you're asking for trouble in the society. So we're clear. Whatever color you are, wherever you came from, however you pray, if you're in Britain legally, then you are the equal of each and every other person in our island. And we will not allow an atmosphere to develop where people whose grandfather was an immigrant, was invited to be an immigrant by the British government, by British industry. Enoch Powell used to tour the Caribbean, begging people to emigrate to England because we needed their labor in the factories, on the buses, on the trains, and many other industries. We will not allow the grandson, granddaughter of people who were here legally to be treated as if somehow they were other, as if somehow they were to blame. It wasn't Abdul, who runs the corner shop on your estate, who devastated the British economy. It was people who looked much more like me. It was people who transferred British industry offshore to make a bigger and quicker buck from it. Now, lastly, on Donald Trump, I started out by praising him for the U-turn that he appears to have made. I say appears because with Donald Trump, you never know. CMLA canceled my last announcement. He's perfectly capable of tweeting something completely opposite later this evening. But I started out by congratulating him on apparently U-turning and dramatically reducing the danger of war with Iran. But I've got to tell you that there's a rising tide of opposition to Donald Trump from his own base. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, people who were instrumental in his victory last November are beginning to get thoroughly fed up of Donald Trump putting America second, of Donald Trump's movement putting not America first, but putting Israel first. Many people in the United States, not just the now majority, who don't like Netanyahu's settler apartheid state, but many people in Donald Trump's own ranks themselves are telling Trump, it's time you shook yourself off this peculiar addiction to the mass murderer, Benjamin Netanyahu. Much more of this coming up. And now, I and you have had the pleasure many times of the company of my first guest this evening, but I never met him until yesterday. And I've got to tell you, he is every bit as lovely in real life as he is on the screen. He is Iran's national treasure, Iran's greatest international asset, though he doesn't like me saying that. So let me introduce for the first time in the studio, Professor Syed Mohammad Mirande, the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Professor, I can't tell you how happy I am to see you here in person. Let's start with the apparent U-turn. You've always got to qualify everything that Donald Trump is said to have made today. Well, he did say it because I saw him saying it, but who knows if it will survive the night. But on the face of it, he just solved the crisis between the US and Iran, didn't he?
Well, it depends on whether there's another U-turn. And also in the interview, it seemed as if there was a U-turn in the interview itself.
A U-turn within the interview.
Exactly. Well, first of all, I wanted to welcome you to Iran, your second home. We do great evil here in the Axis of Evil. We work very hard to satisfy.
You certainly keep us in plenty of material for the show. Yeah.
Well, I'm really grateful that you came here, and it's if you recall, I invited Piers Morgan to come, and he never showed up. And
I'm going to keep the pressure on him.
Yeah, it's very.
I've already started it.
It's excellent.
They're waiting for you here. What are you waiting for? Don't you want to see the country you're regularly traducing?
It's like he seems to be under the pressure that we have a great leader here, and we're all standing in awe, and we're fearful of criticizing the government. And he has this and he and many others have this very bizarre understanding of.
They have a Manichaean approach to all international affairs. You're with us or against us. You're bad or you're good. And it doesn't have anything to do with democracy or any of the things they say it has to do with. It's whether or not you are the official enemy of his state. And usually, the official enemy of his state, the United Kingdom, is really the enemy of the United States.
Exactly.
So back to the United States. Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. They've said that many times. I've confirmed it with everyone here. You know my own view. If I was the leader of Iran, I definitely would have had a nuclear weapon long ago. But you don't want one. Indeed, you're religiously precluded from having one. And if it's the case that Trump's only beef with you is a nuclear weapon, what is there to continue to fight about?
Well, you're right. Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. There are reasons for that. Iran considers it to be inhumane. Some may say, well, that's just pretense. But during the Iran-Iraq war, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons and the military intelligence to use it, and preventing us from purchasing gas masks, leaders, officials, politicians, the military, different people went to the leader, Imam Khomeini, and said, we want to produce chemical weapons. And he said, no. He said, it's inhumane and we're not going there. So there's a history here. Another point is that the Iranians believe that if we produce a nuclear weapon, then a lot of these tiny countries, many of them family dictatorships, not really stable necessarily in the long run, they'll want to pursue nuclear weapons. And that would bring about a very dangerous situation. But Iran has said, Dr. Larijani recently came on television, in fact, said if our nuclear installations are bombed, then we are going to change policy. And the fatwa will change because that will become an existential threat to the nation. So there are circumstances in which Iran would produce a weapon, but that would depend on the United States if they attacked. But if the Americans want to be peaceful, there's no reason why Iran would want to produce a weapon. But the problem, George, and I'm sure you know the answer, is not nuclear weapons, it's not human rights, it's not terrorism, it's Israel. The United States holds great contempt for Iran because Iran is the country that supports the Palestinian people. Of course, I would also add Yemen because Ansarullah and the Yemeni government, they are one, and they represent the people of Yemen. So I would say two governments are supporting the Palestinian people. Because Hezbollah is not the government, even though they are like Ansarullah and Iran. But these two governments, they support the Palestinian people, so they're not tolerated. And any excuse will be used to demonize, to put pressure on people, to hurt the country. Maximum pressure has always been used to target ordinary Iranians, to make them suffer, to make life in this city difficult, as well as across the country. It's all about Israel. Everything is about the Israeli regime. So the United States and the West, to put it bluntly, they are trying to harm ordinary Iranians to preserve and protect a racist regime, an ethno-supremacist regime that believes in a chosen people, that believes its others are Amalek. That is how the West views this region, despite all the facade about democracy and human rights and woke culture that, even in Western society, all these different minute groups have to be protected and given special privileges and status. But in our region, this tiny ethno-supremacist regime which are colonizers, can crush, they can bomb Syria day and night, they can destroy Lebanon, they can bring about genocide and the Holocaust in Gaza, and they are protected and they are supported, and we should remain silent and accept this reality.
And that's the reason they're bombing Yemen. Even last night, the British and the Americans bombed Yemen. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. But aren't there signs, again, with the caveat of U-turns can become double U-turns, 180 degrees, or the Anna Baerbock famous 360 degrees. Everything's possible. But on the face of it, given Trump's statement today, and more importantly, maybe, his sacking of Mike Waltz, the erstwhile national security advisor, now promoted, demoted, who knows, as the US ambassador to the United Nations. He was sacked because Trump insiders are openly being quoted in the main newspapers in the US. He was effectively pursuing Israel's policy rather than Donald Trump's. He was working, to quote a prominent Trump insider inside the White House, he was working for a different president, not the president he was supposed to work for. On the face of it, and I've, as you know, long suspected that the Trump-Netanyahu love affair would not last, because Trump does not like, he wants to be the alpha male. And Netanyahu is a rival for that position in the current picture. The sacking of Waltz, the apparent U-turn, aren't there some signs, straws in the wind, that the previous position of Israel first, last, and always might not actually be forever?
I'm sure that it's not forever. I think the world is changing so fast, and the hostility towards the Israeli regime is so entrenched. I just came back from China a couple of days ago, as you know, and I was in 3 different cities, and everyone who I spoke to was saying that people that they know, and in online conversations and in the media, the hostility towards the Israeli regime is very deep now, and very strong. But we've been here before. It's difficult to say, because if you recall, just a while back, I don't know if it was Truth Social, because I'm not a member. I'm not in it, but I think he reposted a clip of where I forget his name, but he said that Netanyahu, the speaker at Oxford or Cambridge, I think it was Cambridge, says that Netanyahu is a dark.
Yes, he did. You retweeted that on Truth Social.
That's right. So, and then literally a few weeks later, he said, "I spoke with Netanyahu, and we agree on everything."
On everything. Yeah.
So which one is it, or is it both?
Well, it's CMLA, which once used to stand for Chief Martial Law Administrator, but in Trump's case, it's cancel my last announcement. But he's not the only one. if you look at Pete Hegseth, by all accounts, the defense secretary in the US, by all accounts, he and Tulsi Gabbard are fighting within the cabinet against a war for Netanyahu against Iran. And personally, I believe that. And yet Hegseth himself tweets things which, on the face of it, explode any possibility of a negotiated settlement. Maybe this is their art of the deal. If it is, I would never make a deal with someone who behaved towards me like that, but that's maybe why I'm not in business. The ugly tweet that Hegseth issued towards Iran, basically threatening Iran with annihilation, whilst at the same time negotiating with. How do your negotiators, I know you're not one, but you have in the past been in negotiations on the JCPOA. How do your negotiators cope with the fact that the man they're talking to, apparently in a civilized way, is taking out his phone and threatening you with perdition?
Well, it was Jeffrey Sachs, by the way, I just remembered. I think that in those negotiations in 2015, as well as the ones 3 years ago, I was a media advisor. I wasn't at the table, but I spoke to the negotiators and asked them what was going on. The problem with Trump, I think, is that even if we do somehow have a deal, despite the fact that he's constantly flip-flopping, and it's not just Iran. So, for example, the Secretary of Defense, he didn't threaten Iran. He said that we're going to effectively, he said he was going to strike at the time of our own choosing, which is a violation of international law itself. It doesn't help, because it's only going to make the Iranians less trusting and more demanding at the negotiating table for assurances. And but also, even if we somehow do come to an agreement, which is, I don't know if it's possible, because right now Trump had momentum over Ukraine. He could have ended the war early on, and he could have given the concessions that the Russians wanted. He could have ended it. People would have protested, but he had a mandate. He had he'd just come to power. He could have finished it. But now he's sending weapons, and that momentum is gone. On the other hand, he basically, Witkoff on his behalf imposed a ceasefire. We heard that he read the Riot Act on Saturday to Netanyahu, and things stopped. Then literally days later, after the ceasefire agreement was signed, he goes and says the Palestinians must go. They must be ethnically cleansed, which violated the ceasefire agreement that he imposed. Yeah. Then he gave the green light to the restarting of the genocide. So with regards to the Russians, he never did what he said he was going to do one day. With regards to the Palestinians, his own agreement, he undermined. So the Iranians are looking and saying, well, if getting to an agreement with him is very difficult, and if there is an agreement, what if he does what he did to the Palestinians? And just one morning, we wake up and see on Truth Social, he says, nope, it's not going to work. I don't accept the deal.
Yeah, I mean, we have a saying that such a deal is not worth the paper it's written on, or in many cases not written on. And I can see the anxiety that people here would have about that. But it also impacts the domestic politics here, doesn't it? I'm more conscious than I was before I arrived that there's many schools of thought in Iran. Piers Morgan thinks that you're all, North Korean style, all marching to one tune. But actually, Iranians have a wide variety of attitudes towards this. And this kind of behavior from the US administration must strengthen the most radical camp. Because if there's no point in negotiating, then you might as well get busy and make yourselves a giant porcupine so that it's very, very punishing for anyone to attack you.
You know, two things have happened that have really had an impact in Iran, I think, in the last year and a half. One was Gaza. And Gaza, I think, as it continued and as the genocide became worse and as the numbers of murdered children and women and Palestinians in general continued to rise and the images came out, attitudes towards the United States and Iran changed. I see that even among my own students.
Yeah,
so
you're the chair of American Studies. So
well, I'm not actually anymore. But
okay, your students are following these matters in minute detail.
Yeah. So I mean, even students who are not very religious, at least in appearances, or they may not be. They may be very critical. In the past, some of them were liberal, pro-Western, but now they're seeing that this is liberalism where they carry out genocide and they won't stop. And it's, in a way, it's an unprecedented crime because in human history, we've had bigger crimes, but never carried out in front of the global audience nonstop. Exactly. And justifying it like Western commentators constantly do. So this has, I think, really destroyed the image of the West, even among its staunch supporters, among those so-called liberals. The second is Trump himself, George, because people in Iran don't like him, and they see him, his bombastic language and his
vulgarity.
And his vulgarity. So, in the past, some of my friends, my colleagues who are liberal, would tell me that, well, democracy, what did they say? They say it corrects itself. So he'll be gone after like 4 years and it won't happen again. Well, he's back and he has a bigger mandate. He won all the swing states. He got the popular vote. He's back with a vengeance. And when he wasn't there, the genocide was being carried out under a democratic president. So people now, much more than before, understand the state's position when they say we don't trust the United States. When you speak to people, they say this guy's crazy. And how can you negotiate with someone who's irrational and mad? So I think the debate in Iran has shifted away from in the past, and people are more steadfast. Of course, that there's not a single voice. There's still many, many different voices. But I think those who were saying that we should appease the United States, I think those voices are much weaker than they were before. Even though in the past they were never the majority, but they existed, they were louder. I think they're much more muted today.
And freely expressing their view. This is completely unknown in the West. The Iranian media, particularly the plethora of newspapers, are 100 schools of thought contending really rather vibrantly, far more vibrantly than they do in Britain or in the United States. Let's park the US for a moment. Let's assume that they're not going to start bombing us tonight. Israel today stated that the enormous embarrassment they suffered yesterday of a missile fired from Yemen under total continuous bombardment from the poorest country in the region, from people who go around with daggers in their belts, penetrated all of the defense systems in Tel Aviv at the international airport and landed on the tarmac of Ben Gurion Airport. So humiliating is this for Netanyahu. He's decided to say it wasn't Yemen at all, it was Iran. We're holding Iran responsible for this, even though there isn't any way that it can be the responsibility of Iran. These people don't have maps. The danger, therefore, is that even if Trump does not attack Iran, Netanyahu will.
couple of things, I think. One is that even if Trump attacks Iran, George, what can he do? He can bomb a few places, but B-52s are not the safest. They're not the most sophisticated aircraft in the world, and they're not stealth by any means. They could lose pilots, and many can be downed. Iran's air defenses are quite good. And they would have to come all the way from Diego Garcia, because these countries in the Persian Gulf region are not going to allow them to bomb Iran from their facilities. That would be the end of their reign in any of these countries if they did so. But even if the Americans come from Diego Garcia, those bases are all fair game, or all American assets wherever they are in the region. But they would have to come 5,000 kilometers. And then they would also have to have aircraft supporting them. It's not going to be easy. The Russians and the Ukrainians, they've been at war for well over 3 years. And while the Russians are winning, still, although day and night they're bombing the Ukrainians at all levels, with artillery, with aircraft, with drones, with missiles, they're still there. They're still fighting. So I don't think a few American jets can do much harm, but the Iranian retaliation could actually do much more harm to the Americans, because the Americans are all over the place, and Iran has really sort of like an infinite number of drones and missiles to use. Yeah, I think the Iranians have over 300 underground bases, which can't be touched, as we've been seeing in Yemen. The Americans haven't been able to destroy those bases. How can they destroy those in Iran? So an American attack would be very limited in scope, and the Iranian response would not be good for the Americans. The Israelis don't have the capacity to strike Iran. They would need the Americans to attack Iran. So if the Israeli regime chose to attack Iran, that would mean that the Americans would be involved. Now, my understanding, and I'm not privy to private intelligence, but my understanding is that the Iranians used True Promise 1 and True Promise 2 to learn about Israeli defenses and its capabilities. And over the past few months, they've been working day and night to prepare themselves for real conflict. And I think that, and we saw just tonight, they showed a new missile, a more advanced missile that obviously would be used in case of conflict. If the Israelis strike Iran this time around, I think the Iranians will be relentless, and their missiles will be much more. They will hit those targets with much greater accuracy than ever before. It won't be. It's not something that the Israeli regime can win. So I think ultimately it's up to Trump, but it's not something they cannot defeat Iran. And war with Iran, George, you know this better than anyone else because you were a key person in the anti-war movement. The Iraq war, they had to bring in 600,000 people alongside their coalition. If they want to fight Iran, they'd have to bring in, 1.5 million people? Do they even have those numbers? Where are they going to bring them? Do they have that money? Who's going to host them? We live in a different world today. Yeah. Iran is not Iraq. The United States is not the United States of 2003. So war is out of the question, that sort of war. At most, they can carry out a few airstrikes, and I think it would not end well for the United States.
In early April 2025, China and Iran signed a landmark $15 billion agreement to jointly develop the South Pars gas field, the world's largest natural gas reserve with an estimated 140 trillion cubic meters of gas. The signing ceremony was attended by Dai Holiang, chairman of China National Petroleum Corporation, and Javad Oji, CEO of the National Iranian Oil Company. Under the agreement, China will provide advanced deep-sea drilling technology and substantial financial investment, with the goal of increasing the field's production capacity by 40% by 2027. At the same time, both sides officially launched the China-Iran Railway Corridor project, aiming to connect Kashgar in Xinjiang to Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf. This new route is expected to cut land transportation costs by 30% and boost annual freight capacity to 50 million tons. These developments mark a significant deepening of China-Iran strategic cooperation, enhancing energy collaboration and strengthening infrastructure connectivity across Eurasia. Building on this momentum, on March 5, 2025, China and Iran announced the scheduled official opening of the China-Iran Railway, a milestone that represents a major breakthrough in regional connectivity and global trade dynamics. This highly anticipated infrastructure project is set to revolutionize the transportation of Iranian oil and goods to China, with an expected surge in the volume of affordable imports. Spanning over 1,350 kilometers, the China-Iran Railway is poised to reduce dependency on vulnerable maritime routes and significantly enhance trade flows between China, Iran, and Central Asia. The announcement sparked widespread discussions online, with many observers highlighting the profound strategic implications for global energy markets. In an era defined by globalization, regional cooperation and economic integration have become key drivers of international development. The China-Iran Railway, a crucial component of the Belt and Road Initiative, is not merely a transnational infrastructure project. It serves as a strategic economic corridor linking West Asia and the Middle East. Iran has seen a series of favorable developments in this regard. After 7 years of negotiations, a long-anticipated agreement with China finally materialized, culminating in China's largest infrastructure deal of the year. Although initially planned for full opening by the end of 2025, recent updates show that while the railway is nearing completion, full commercial operation has not yet been confirmed. However, freight train services between Iran and China restarted in mid-2024 via the Central Asia Corridor, marking a crucial first phase of this broader initiative. The launch of these cargo routes through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan has significantly improved connectivity between China and Iran, establishing a vital overland link. Iran has committed to investing $750 million into its rail transport sector, purchasing 600 oil tank cars, 300 diesel passenger coaches, and 50 locomotives to enhance operational capabilities. These steps indicate that Iran is rapidly preparing for the expected surge in trade activity as full railway operations come online. Set to provide a direct land-based route for Chinese oil imports from the Middle East, the China-Iran Railway will allow China to circumvent the Strait of Malacca and significantly reduce its dependency on Pakistan as a primary trade conduit. It will also offer Central Asian nations direct access to the Indian Ocean, enhancing regional trade opportunities. Iranian authorities have confirmed that Chabahar port will play a central role in cargo transportation for the new route. With this direct link, Central Asian nations will more easily access global markets, boosting exports and foreign exchange revenues. The railway is projected to have an annual freight capacity exceeding 8.5 million tons, while Chabahar port's handling capacity is expected to rise to 33 million tons. Meanwhile, Iran's oil exports to China have already seen a substantial surge. In March 2025, China's imports of Iranian crude reached a record-breaking 1.8 million barrels per day, nearly 50% higher than the 2024 average. This surge was fueled by Chinese independent refineries rushing to secure supplies amid concerns over potential new U.S. sanctions. Despite sanctions targeting some Chinese refineries, Iranian oil continues to arrive steadily at Chinese ports, underscoring China's commitment to diversifying its energy imports and securing stable supply channels. Although geographically centered in Central Asia, the China-Iran Railway maintains a strong connection to China's strategic ambitions. Initially, construction faced several delays tied to both political and logistical challenges. However, The project gained significant momentum following the signing of the 25-year strategic agreement between China and Iran, which also coincided with renewed railway development. Previously, India had expressed interest in partnering on this initiative, but as construction progressed, it became evident that Chinese influence was decisive. Iranian officials later clarified that no official agreement had ever been signed with India. The completion of the China-Iran railway presents two significant advantages for China. Firstly, it injects renewed momentum into the Belt and Road Initiative by creating a seamless trade network that links the overland and maritime Silk Roads. Secondly, it provides a strategic alternative to traditional maritime bottlenecks, particularly the geopolitically sensitive Strait of Malacca. By leveraging Chabahar Port and expanding rail connections, China is building a resilient trade network that mitigates risks, lowers transportation costs, and reduces transit times. Iran's eastward railway strategy is anchored by three major routes. The northern strategy involves a railway extending into Kazakhstan, linking Iran with the primary belt and road corridor. The southern strategy features a railway connecting Iran with Pakistan, forming a key segment of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The eastern strategy, meanwhile, has focused on connecting Iran to Herat, Afghanistan, as a centerpiece for future rail extensions that will eventually provide direct land routes to China and Central Asia. Though instability in Afghanistan has delayed full integration, the foundations for future expansion are actively being laid. Beyond China and Iran, broader regional railway initiatives are also gathering pace. Iran and Russia have agreed to start constructing the Rashtastra railway section by late March 2025, strengthening the North-South international transport corridor and enhancing regional trade links between Asia and Europe. These investments are transforming Eurasia into a unified economic bloc, with rail and road systems promoting economic cohesion and reducing reliance on maritime trade routes. Initially, the China-Iran trade corridor will focus on high-volume cargo transportation, with ships ferrying large consignments of Chinese goods to Iran and returning with crude oil and other vital resources. As the route matures, there is potential for expansion into broader Middle Eastern markets, including Saudi Arabia via Iraq. The strategy is to first solidify Iran as a central logistics hub before exploring more direct east-west transit corridors through Afghanistan once conditions stabilize. China's success with its China-Europe rail network has set a powerful precedent. In 2020, China-Europe rail traffic exceeded 12,000 trips, and by 2021, the numbers continued rising steadily. The growth of Trans-Eurasian rail links activated key trade hubs across Russia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, reshaping the global trading landscape. South Korean and Japanese exports increasingly utilize these rail lines, highlighting the shifting dynamics of global trade. By 2020, China had overtaken the US to become the EU's largest trading partner, largely due to the success of these networks. Despite this success, before now China lacked a direct rail link to the Middle East. Given the immense scale of China-Middle East crude oil trade and the growing volume of Chinese exports to the region, a dedicated China-Iran railway was both necessary and inevitable. The new railway corridor, supplemented by connections through Kazakhstan and Pakistan, is rapidly closing that gap. Integration with Gwadar Port in Pakistan and potential future links through a stabilized Afghanistan will only further cement this development. The internationalization of the Chinese yuan and the development of petroleum-backed RMB transactions add another layer of importance to the China-Iran railway. By establishing secure rail routes to the Middle East, China is positioning the RMB to gain traction in regional energy transactions, aligning perfectly with the broader goals of the Belt and Road Initiative. A fully integrated China-Iran railway will unlock Eurasia's full economic potential, enhancing China's influence in global finance and infrastructure networks across Asia, Europe, and Africa. Iran's strategic position as a bridge between Asia and Europe makes it an invaluable partner in China's vision for a redefined global commerce landscape. As China continues to invest in Iranian infrastructure and deepen bilateral ties, the foundation for a far-reaching transcontinental trade network is being firmly laid. As this vision materializes, the China-Iran Railway will play a pivotal role in transforming global trade and reshaping the architecture of international economic diplomacy.
Donald Trump has made it clear that one of his top goals is to maintain the global dominance of the US dollar. When he campaigned to be US president in 2024, he promised that he would punish any country around the world that sought alternatives to the US dollar by hitting them with 100% tariffs.
Many countries are leaving the dollar. They're not going to leave the dollar with me. I'll say, you leave the dollar. You're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. Sir, we would like very much to get back to the dollar immediately. Thank you very much. It's so easy. I don't know.
Donald Trump also warned that if the US dollar lost its status as the global reserve currency, it would be like losing a major war.
I'm very much a traditionalist. I like staying with the dollar. You know that from when I was there. It's make the dollar the choice. I hate when countries go off the dollar. I would not allow countries to go off the dollar because when we lose that standard, that will be like losing a revolutionary war. That will be a hit to our country, just like losing a war. And we can't let that happen. And too many countries now are fighting to get off the dollar.
Now, this is all quite ironic because since Trump has returned for his second term as US president, his tariffs and trade war have actually accelerated the decline of the US dollar and the global move toward de-dollarization, which refers to the tendency of other countries to seek alternatives to the US dollar and use other currencies in international trade and to hold other assets in their foreign exchange reserves. Western media outlets have warned that Trump's tariffs have put the dollar's safe haven status in jeopardy. Until recently, de-dollarization was largely associated with global South countries, especially those that are members of BRICS, that was founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS has been creating new institutions to try to encourage de-dollarization, seeking alternatives to the US dollar in an attempt to reform the international financial system, which is dominated by the US and its currency. And we have seen more and more signs of this. The Financial Times published a long report on how China is quietly diversifying away from US government debt, US Treasury securities, and seeking alternatives. I'm going to talk about that a bit later in this analysis today. But what's incredible about this accelerated move toward de-dollarization is that it's not just countries doing this for geopolitical reasons, it's also financial institutions. And the Financial Times published another article about Deutsche Bank, the major German bank. The global head of foreign exchange research at Deutsche Bank said this, quote, "We are witnessing a simultaneous collapse in the price of all US assets, including equities, the dollar versus alternative reserve foreign exchange, and the bond market. We are entering uncharted territory in the global financial system," end quote. This analyst at a major German bank then continued saying that the market is rapidly de-dollarizing. In a typical crisis environment, the market would be hoarding dollar assets, but instead, the market has lost faith in US assets. It is actively selling down US assets. And as this Deutsche Bank researcher said, quote, US administration policy, that is Trump administration policy, is encouraging a trend toward de-dollarization to safeguard international investors from a weaponization of dollar liquidity, end quote. So this is the ultimate irony. Donald Trump claimed that he would save the dominance of the US dollar by threatening countries all around the world. But in reality, his tariff threats have only accelerated the move toward de-dollarization, not just for geopolitical reasons, but for financial reasons. And what's incredible is we're even seeing longtime US allies like Japan float the possibility of selling the huge sums of US government debt that they hold as a bargaining chip, because the Trump administration is trying to impose these aggressive demands on its so-called allies, and they're pushing back and saying they're not going to tolerate it. And what all of this is showing is how rapidly Donald Trump's trade war blew back and blew up in his face. Trump first declared tariffs on countries all around the world at the beginning of April on so-called Liberation Day. That was on the 2nd of April. And then a week later, Trump temporarily paused the tariffs he threatened on countries around the world, instead imposing a blanket 10% tariff on all countries. But he singled out China and rapidly raised tariffs on China to 145%, which essentially is a kind of nuclear trade war. Trump already started a trade war on China during his first term as president back in 2018, but now in his second term, he accelerated that to a full-on nuclear trade war. And then Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, said the quiet part loud, and he admitted that what the U.S. is trying to do is to contain China, to weaken China. Bessent revealed that Trump wanted to use tariffs to force other countries to join the U.S. And as Bessent said, quote, "We can approach China as a group," end quote. So Washington was trying to use its tariffs to force Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India to all work together to isolate China in what Bessent described as a, quote, grand encirclement strategy. However, that strategy has not worked as the Trump administration thought it would. In fact, it also blew back. And immediately after Trump announced all these new tariffs, including sky-high tariffs on Vietnam, which is one of the major trading partners of the US, what happened? China's President Xi Jinping took a trip to Vietnam and had a very friendly meeting with Vietnamese leadership, and they signed more than 40 bilateral agreements deepening their partnership. So the US attempt to try to recruit Vietnam against China did not work. In fact, Trump's tariffs have been pushing China, South Korea, and Japan to cooperate more closely, despite the fact that these are countries that have very significant differences. I mean, Japan colonized China and South Korea. There's still a lot of anger in the region toward Japan and the horrific imperial crimes it committed in the 1930s and 40s. Yet despite those differences, just a few days before Trump announced these tariffs on so-called Liberation Day in April, what happened? For the first time in 5 years, South Korea, China, and Japan held an economic meeting to discuss ways in which they can cooperate to soften the impact of Trump's trade war. And even in Japan, which is one of the closest US allies on earth, there's more and more outrage over Trump's tariff threats. Japanese lawmakers are publicly condemning Trump, comparing him to a, quote, delinquent kid, end quote, over his tariff threats. And Japan has been holding trade negotiations with the US, and the talks are not going nearly as well as the Trump administration hoped. Japan has been pushing back quite a bit against the threat of US tariffs on Japanese autos, that's cars, and also steel. And one of the most shocking developments in these trade talks is that Japan's finance minister floated the idea that Japan could sell off the huge sums of US Treasury securities, that is US government debt that it has, as part of a negotiating tactic, which would be a quite extreme measure, but it shows that Japan is pushing back. And this idea that the Trump administration had, that they can simply bully all these countries and push them around, even longtime US allies like Japan, which has been militarily occupied by the United States for 80 years, even Japan is pushing back. Now, one of the main reasons that Trump took a step back from his tariff threats in April is because of backlash in the bond market. So Trump announced these massive tariffs on the 2nd of April, and in the week following that, there was a rapid increase in the yield on the US 10-year Treasury note. This is one of the most important financial assets, not only in the US economy, but in the global economy, because other interest rates are often set based on the yield on the US 10-year note. So when the yield shot up, this was a sign that investors were selling their holdings of US Treasury securities and seeking other assets, and that US government debt was no longer being seen as the safest asset. This really terrified the Trump administration and forced Trump to take a step back. So if a major holder of US Treasury securities started to sell off that debt, this could cause a crisis in the US bond market. But Trump is still insisting on imposing more and more tariffs. He says this is only a temporary pause, and he's very serious about these tariff threats. So now other countries, including the major US ally Japan, are saying, fine, if you want to do this to us, we can respond by causing a crisis in your bond market. Japan is the single largest foreign holder of US Treasury securities. That's US government debt. Japan's central bank holds more than $1.1 trillion of US Treasury securities in its reserves. And you know what the second biggest foreign holder of US government debt is? China, the Chinese mainland, with over $700 billion of US Treasury securities in its reserves. And in response to Trump's nuclear trade war on China, the Wall Street Journal warned that Beijing has some cards that it can also play. As the Wall Street Journal put it, China has two major financial weapons: its holdings of US Treasuries and its currency, the yuan. As this leading US newspaper put it, quote, "The escalating trade conflict between the US and China has reignited fears that Beijing could use financial markets to hit back at Washington. There have long been fears that China could dump the US Treasuries that make up a large chunk of its foreign exchange reserves," end quote. Now, China has been slowly but gradually de-dollarizing its reserves over the past decade. China's official holdings of US Treasury securities peaked in 2014 and have fallen since then. And if you look at China's investments in US assets as a percentage of its GDP, it has been steadily declining since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And the Financial Times published a long report detailing how Trump's tariffs against China and trade war have only accelerated the move toward de-dollarization in Beijing. This report quoted influential Chinese scholars who wrote, quote, "The safety of US Treasuries is no longer a given. That era is behind us, and we should be concerned about that change from the safeguarding perspective of our Treasury holdings," end quote. And another major reason cited by Chinese scholars was the fact that in 2022, the United States and also the European Union froze and seized around $300 billion worth of dollar and euro denominated assets that were held by Russia's central bank. This was in response to the proxy war in Ukraine between NATO, led by the US on one side, and Russia on the other. But Russia was not the only country whose reserves were frozen and effectively stolen by the US and the broader West. There have been several other examples of countries in the global South who have been targeted by what's essentially international piracy by the West, including Iran, North Korea, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan. Now, those countries are relatively small, whereas Russia is a huge country, a major power. So when the US-led West seized Russia's foreign assets, that was a wake-up call to countries around the world. And officials at their central banks started thinking about how they could diversify away from US dollar assets before they're the next victim. And this is certainly what's been happening for years now in China. Now, to be clear, this Financial Times report makes it clear that Chinese officials don't want to simply dump all of their US Treasury holdings for a few different reasons. First of all, this would be a kind of last resort. It would be a major escalation. And China is actually trying to be diplomatic, and it's defending itself, and it's responding to Trump's attacks proportionately. But China doesn't want to escalate it further. And also, China doesn't want to lose a lot of the value of its reserves, because if China were to dump all of these US Treasuries, then the value of existing US Treasury securities would fall. Yields would go up. And when yields go up, the current bonds that are out there, they fall in price. So China doesn't want to hurt itself by reducing the value of its holdings as it dumps them onto the market, But again, this is a last resort if China needed to do so. The Financial Times report makes it clear that what China prefers is a gradual transition from treasuries to other assets, including foreign bonds and also gold. And Chinese officials describe this as maneuvering on a tightrope. However, as Trump continues to escalate his trade war against China, it's increasingly untenable to be walking on a tightrope when you have a bunch of fire and a volcano under you. And Chinese officials are warning that what the Trump administration is doing could basically amount not only to a seizure of China's holdings, but even a default on U.S. national debt. Because in the financial press, there has been more and more discussion of the idea of a so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord based on the Plaza Accord the Ronald Reagan administration imposed on U.S. allies in 1985. And Trump's top economic advisor, the economist Stephen Miron, has proposed the possibility of the U.S. forcing other countries to swap their current treasury holdings for 100-year U.S. government bonds with no coupon, no yield. So that means that with inflation over time, other countries are going to lose value on the bonds that they hold, U.S. government bonds. So this is essentially a way by which other countries will fund the U.S. government. They'll be giving their money to fund the U.S.
They could simply write checks to Treasury. That would help us finance global public goods as well.
And Chinese financial officials are saying that this would essentially amount to a de facto U.S. government default on its debt. So this would not only impact China, it would impact all countries around the world, because basically all central banks around the world at least have some of their reserves held in U.S. assets, largely U.S. Treasury securities. Now, as I said, I want to make this clear. It's not just Donald Trump that is responsible for this de-dollarization. This has been a process going on for well over a decade. Between 2015 and 2022, China's holdings of U.S. Treasury securities fell by 17%. But in the past few years, it has rapidly accelerated, especially after the seizure of Russia's U.S. assets in 2022. So between 2022 and 2024, China reduced its official treasury holdings by more than 27%. So again, we've seen an acceleration, and Trump's trade war is going to only accelerate that even further. So this raises an important question. As China reduces its holdings of U.S. assets, what is it replacing them with? Because China has a massive current account surplus, a huge trade surplus with the rest of the world. So it has all of these excess dollars and other currencies it gets from trading. What does it do with those excess currencies? If it simply converts everything into yuan, into its local currency, that would cause the price of the yuan to go up significantly against other currencies, which would hurt the competitiveness of Chinese exports. China doesn't want to have an overvalued yuan, which could contribute to deindustrialization and many of the problems we've seen in the US. So instead, China has been seeking alternatives. And what have those alternatives been? Well, one of them is that China has been seeking holdings of sovereign debt of other countries, including in Europe, so different European bonds from Germany and Switzerland, and also Japan. So buying Japanese assets denominated in the Japanese currency, the yen. And another major asset that China has been investing in is gold. And it's not just China that's doing this. There are many countries, especially in the global south, that have been stockpiling gold in their reserves. And if you look at the list of the top 10 countries that in the past decade have added the most gold to their reserves, you can see that many of them are in BRICS or BRICS curious. They're around BRICS, including number 1, China, number 2, Russia, number 3, Turkey, which has been invited to join BRICS, number 4, India, which is the I in BRICS, also Kazakhstan, Singapore, Qatar, Uzbekistan, and many other countries, especially in the global south. And why is that? Well, a big reason is that these countries are afraid that the U.S. could seize their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. just like the US seized Russia's holdings and Iran's holdings and Venezuela's holdings. However, I should emphasize that this is not just geopolitical. It also goes back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis in the US. Because if you analyze global data of central bank holdings of gold, you can see that they were declining throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But then immediately in 2009, with the US financial crisis, what happened? That trend suddenly reversed, and we've seen a significant increase in central bank purchases of gold. So this is another sign that other countries are not only de-dollarizing for geopolitical reasons, but simply they are losing faith in the US financial system, given how the US economy has been built on a massive bubble. And as the US economy has financialized, it's looking more and more dangerous. This is a big reason why the price of gold has been skyrocketing for years, but especially in 2024 and 2025, with more and more countries afraid of Trump's tariffs and potential seizure of their treasury holdings, or fears of a de facto US government default on its debt through the Mar-a-Lago Accord and these 100-year zero coupon bonds. There's more and more instability, there's more and more uncertainty, and foreign investors, including a lot of foreign central banks, have been piling into gold, which surpassed 3,000 US dollars and has continued rising very rapidly. What we're essentially seeing is a kind of unofficial US dollar devaluation against gold. You know, the US dollar has been at the heart of the global financial system since at least 1944 in the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II, if not a bit earlier in the 1920s and 30s. And now what we're seeing is that as the role of the US dollar declines, there's a kind of unofficial devaluation of the US dollar, at least against gold. And at least in the short term, this is what we're seeing with the US dollar falling against many other currencies. Now, I should be clear here. The foreign exchange market is often pretty volatile, and it's very possible that the US dollar could go back up. But in response to Trump's tariffs and foreign investors selling off US assets, what we've seen is that the US dollar has fallen pretty substantially against the yen, the Japanese currency. And we've also seen the US dollar fall pretty significantly against the euro by more than 8% so far in 2025, which is a pretty significant move. And this is because a lot of foreign investors have been selling their holdings of US assets, including US Treasury securities, and instead converting their dollars to euros and buying euro-denominated assets, including European bonds like German bonds, for instance. And the same thing has been happening with the Swiss franc. You know, Switzerland is not part of the European Union. It has its own currency. And the US dollar has fallen nearly 9% against the Swiss franc so far in 2025. Again, as foreign investors sell US assets and buy Swiss assets. So this is all very important, and I would say historic, because I've been reporting for several years now on the global de-dollarization movement, with countries around the world seeking alternatives to the dominance of the US dollar. And critics of my work, skeptics, have long said that there's no alternative to the US dollar. The common talking point that they repeat is that the US dollar may have its issues, but they say that the US dollar is the cleanest shirt in the laundry basket with other dirty currencies. But what we're actually seeing is that this talking point, there's no alternative to the US dollar, and there's no alternative to the US Treasury security as the backbone of the global financial system, it's proving not to be true. There are increasingly alternatives. As Bloomberg put it in an article, quote, "The world is finding a plausible alternative to treasuries," end quote. Bloomberg noted in this article from April that, quote, "Global investors are finding there are credible alternatives to US Treasury bonds," end quote, and that foreign investors have been piling into European bonds, especially German Bunds, which is the German term for bond, and also Japanese bonds. And one of the reasons for this is that foreign investors have not only lost confidence in the US government with fears over a de facto default through a Mar-a-Lago Accord and the weaponization of the US dollar, but also simply because a lot of foreign investors are domestically exposed to a different currency. They don't use dollars at home. At home, they use the Japanese yen if they're in Japan, or if they're in Europe, they use the euro. And as their currency has been rising against the dollar, as the dollar has been depreciating against their currencies, that means that they're losing value on their investments in their local currency. So, of course, they're going to reduce their exposure to US assets and invest more in assets in their local currency so they don't lose value on their investment. And this is especially the case for Japan, because for years now, global investors have engaged in something known as a carry trade, where the yields on Japanese bonds were much lower than the yields on US Treasury securities, because the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, had interest rates that were much higher than the Japanese central bank's interest rate. So they were taking advantage of that interest rate differential. This is known in finance as an arbitrage trade, is that investors would borrow money in Japanese yen. They would take on debt and pay low interest rates on that Japanese debt. And then they would convert those Japanese yen into US dollars and buy US assets, like, for instance, US stocks or US bonds. However, that only works if, one, the US stocks they buy go up in price, and there's been a lot of volatility in the stock market, so they've been burnt by that. And two, if the value of US bonds doesn't fall, especially in terms of their foreign exchange risk. So they have to pay back that debt they owe in yen. And when the yen was falling against the US dollar, they were fine. But now that the dollar is falling against the yen, now that the yen is going up against the dollar, that means that these investors engaged in this carry trade have been burnt and have been selling off US assets, which also contributed to a lot of volatility in the US stock market and the bond market. And then they've been converting those dollars into yen to pay off the debt. There's been this unwinding of the carry trade. This is also what happened back in August of 2024, when there was a temporary crash in the US stock market and other stock markets due to this unwinding of the carry trade. And now Trump's tariffs have unleashed even more chaos, which has only incentivized foreign investors, especially in Japan, to reduce their exposure to US holdings. So what all of this shows is that the more that Donald Trump threatens countries around the world with tariffs and trade war, he says he was going to try to save the dominance of the US dollar. But the more he does that, he's actually accelerating the decline of US dollar hegemony and the acceleration of de-dollarization. Again, as I've reiterated here, this is not something that started with Trump, but it's a process that he is accelerating. If you go back to 2000, more than 70% of the foreign exchange reserves held by central banks around the world was in US dollar assets. As of 2022, that figure has fallen to somewhere in the 50th percentile range. If you measure for differences in the exchange rate, it's around 56%, and Trump's tariffs are now going to further accelerate that decline, and it's very likely that in a few years, that figure will fall below 50% as foreign central banks diversify and seek new assets to hold in their reserves. And what this is confirming is an argument that I have been making and other analysts have been making for several years now, which is that we are seeing more and more of a multipolar currency world. Now, I'm not saying, and I've never said, that the US dollar is going to immediately collapse and there's going to be hyperinflation and it's going to become toilet paper. Anyone saying that is not serious. However, it's also not serious to deny the fact that the dominance of the US dollar is declining, and there's not going to be one currency that simply replaces the US dollar at the center of the global financial system. It's not going to be one currency. It's going to be a multipolar currency world, as even the Financial Times has been acknowledging. So foreign central banks and foreign financial institutions and pension funds and insurance companies and asset managers, they're not only going to be holding US assets, US stocks, and US bonds. They're investing in many other assets and diversifying their holdings. And this is going to cause significant problems for the United States. because one of the main reasons that the US has been able to maintain massive current account deficits, that is, huge trade deficits with the rest of the world for decades, is because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. So as the US runs larger and larger trade deficits with other countries, it floods the world with dollars, and people and companies and financial firms and foreign central banks all around the world, they would take those dollars and invest them in US assets. And this is the way by which the US was able to finance these huge current account deficits. But as global demand for the dollar decreases, because the US dollar's dominance is decreasing over time, it's going to become more and more difficult for the US to finance its enormous current account deficit. And that also means it's going to become more difficult for the US government to finance its huge fiscal deficit without significant inflation. Because yes, it is true that the US government owes debt in dollars, which the US can print. It's not like Argentina. Argentina owes debt in dollars, but Argentina can't print dollars. The US government can print dollars, but when it prints dollars, that obviously causes inflation, and inflation is already a significant problem in the US, which is why the Federal Reserve doesn't want to reduce interest rates further. So historically, the US government has relied on foreign investors to help to finance its large fiscal deficits. As recently as 2015, just a decade ago, about 34% of all US Treasury securities were held by foreigners. However, in the past decade, that number has fallen substantially, and it's now just 23% of US Treasury securities are held by foreigners. And all of these policies that Trump is carrying out are likely to accelerate this decline. So there will be fewer and fewer foreign holders of US Treasury securities, which means that it'll be more and more difficult for the US government to finance these huge deficits without significant inflation. Again, the US can print the currency, but that will cause inflation. And this is why the Trump administration, and in particular the billionaire hedge fund manager who's the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, this is why they're so concerned about the bond market, and why Bessent constantly says publicly that the Trump administration is trying to bring down the yield on the 10-year Treasury security. Because the US government is now spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year just paying the interest on its national debt. Federal interest payments are now more than 3% of US GDP, and they have skyrocketed in the past few years after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates due to the inflation that was largely caused by the supply chain shocks coming out of the COVID pandemic. But inflation has remained stubbornly high, and Trump's tariffs are only going to make inflation even worse, which means the Fed is likely not going to cut interest rates, which means that interest payments will remain enormous for the US government. This is why Donald Trump has been publicly attacking the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, calling him a loser. So that's a quote, calling him a loser, and demanding that he reduce rates now, and now written in all caps, because Trump is really concerned about this issue. But the irony is that the more that Trump attacks the independence of the Fed, the more he's scaring off foreign investors and encouraging them to sell their holdings of US Treasury securities, which is only accelerating the very same problems that the Trump administration is so concerned about. So what I think all of this confirms is the argument that we here at Geopolitical Economy Report have been making for a while, which is that de-dollarization is here to stay, and it's growing, and it's accelerating, and it's no longer just global South countries in and around BRICS that are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. Increasingly, it's global investors who are de-dollarizing, and it's even longtime US allies like Japan and some European countries that are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. And the more that Donald Trump threatens foreign countries and says he's going to impose more and more tariffs and wage trade war and sanctions and other forms of economic warfare, this is actually blowing back and it's accelerating the decline of the dominance of the US dollar. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical.
They planted the fields. They prayed for rain. But when harvest came, there were no buyers, no contracts, no checks, just silence. In just 6 weeks, U.S. farm exports to China dropped 28%. At the port of Oakland, almond and dairy shipments collapsed by 40%. And now, hay exporters in Washington are laying off a quarter of their staff because the buyers are gone and Washington isn't replacing them. This isn't a headline. It's the collapse of the American farm economy. Quiet, fast, and government approved. So ask yourself, how does the richest farm economy on earth wind up begging for markets while its leaders celebrate a trade war? U.S. sorghum exports to China didn't just dip, they were obliterated. In just 2 months, shipments dropped from 1.4 million metric tons in early 2023 to just 78,000 in the same period this year, a 94.4% collapse according to USDA trade data. The reason? Beijing's retaliatory tariff regime, now exceeding 125% on U.S. agricultural imports, has rendered American grain not just uncompetitive, but commercially irrelevant in its largest export market. Yet even as silos overflow and sorghum prices tank with no alternative buyers, the federal response remains symbolic, not structural. The White House's promise that farmers would have a field day now reads less like strategy and more like satire, especially as China pivots to Brazil and Argentina for long-term grain deals. And the question left hanging is, if this wasn't the plan, then why is no one pulling the brakes? The data paints a clear sequence. Tariffs go up, demand disappears, and supply chains reroute permanently. China purchased over 90% of exported U.S. sorghum before the trade war. That pipeline is now severed, but the implications go beyond one crop. As Beijing redirects import contracts toward Latin America, the structural underpinnings of U.S. export dominance are being disassembled at speed. According to Bloomberg, China's soybean imports from Brazil surged 25% year over year, while U.S. soy futures fell over 14% in Q1 2025. These are not tactical shifts, they're permanent rewrites of trade infrastructure. And if American policymakers believe tariffs can be reversed as easily as they were applied, they may be fundamentally misreading how global commodity logistics actually function. At the Port of Oakland, America's #1 gateway for refrigerated agricultural exports, cargo slowdowns are translating into layoffs, demurrage costs, and mounting economic strain. Port Executive Director Christy McKinney warned that retaliatory slowdowns are jeopardizing not just farm exports like almonds, dairy, and beef, but the livelihoods of dock workers, truckers, and warehouse staff. Oakland's 50-50 import-export ratio makes it uniquely vulnerable to trade retaliation. According to port traffic reports, China represents 29% of Oakland's total trade volume, and retaliatory tariffs are targeting nearly every U.S. export category that moves through it. The concern isn't abstract. It's containers sitting idle, contracts getting canceled, and exporters eating fees for shipments now abandoned at sea. Forage exporters have reported 68 blanked sailings since Trump announced the April 2nd tariff spike. According to the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, one Washington-based hay supplier laid off 25% of its staff within 2 weeks, citing canceled shipments and unsustainable freight premiums. Meanwhile, a wood pulp exporter saw 6,400 metric tons of product frozen in warehouse limbo, and 15 rail cars incurring demurrage fees while waiting for diversion instructions. One shipment of 9,000 metric tons en route to China now faces abandonment risk. We cannot absorb ocean freight increases without selling at a loss, one exporter wrote. And the logic unravels quickly. How can low-margin bulk commodities survive a price environment designed for high-value luxury goods? The USTR's new Ships Act port fees, exceeding $1.5 million per Chinese vessel, exclude bulk agriculture, but not containerized ag, which accounts for 55% of the value of all U.S. ag exports, according to USDA figures. That includes beef, poultry, dairy, almonds, frozen foods, and processed items like French fries. Peter Friedman of AgTC warned CNBC that this carve-out failure risks punishing the most valuable segment of U.S. farm exports just as global buyers are abandoning U.S. suppliers. And yet, despite industry pleas, the USTR declined to comment on whether exemptions for containerized ag are being considered. With no answer, exporters are left to calculate how many more containers they can ship at a loss before they stop shipping at all. Supply chain adjustments aren't weekend affairs. They're multi-year pivots involving logistics contracts, infrastructure shifts, and new financing terms. Brazil's soybean trade with China, for instance, didn't happen overnight. It took 3 years of volume ramp-up, government subsidies, and port upgrades. Now that China has locked in these alternatives, American re-entry into that market, if ever, would require renegotiating from a weakened position. Unlike domestic policy cycles, global agriculture responds to long-term incentives. And the current signal from Washington, according to traders interviewed by Reuters, is instability. So buyers are hedging their bets elsewhere. The danger isn't just losing this year's contracts, it's vanishing from the next decade's spreadsheets. The White House has floated another bailout to stave off mass bankruptcies. But multiple farmer associations, including the National Farmers Union and American Soybean Association, are now voicing skepticism. A check doesn't reopen a closed port. It doesn't rebuild a broken contract, and it doesn't replace trust lost with international buyers. In Iowa, corn farmers told Bloomberg they are planting acreage knowing they will likely lose money simply because not planting at all guarantees bankruptcy faster. In Kentucky, farmers are debating whether to harvest at all. They're not chasing profit anymore. They're triaging losses. And yet Washington continues to speak in stimulus packages, while the industry itself is asking for one thing only: access to markets. For the first time in years, major farm groups are supporting legislation to restrict White House tariff powers. The National Farmers Union now backs a bill requiring congressional approval for broad trade actions, arguing the unchecked authority has caused disproportionate harm to agriculture. Peter Friedman echoed this, telling CNBC that the current state is not approaching a crisis, but is a full-blown crisis. And industry alignment on this issue is rare, which underscores the urgency. The American Farm Bureau Federation, long seen as a conservative anchor in ag policy, has joined the call for restraint, signaling that the economic cost of unilateral trade war is no longer justifiable, even by those who once supported it. Tariffs are designed to shield domestic producers from cheap imports, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. According to AgTC and USDA figures, retaliatory tariffs from China, Canada, and the EU have slashed U.S. farm exports and flooded domestic markets with unsold inventory. China's cancellation of a 12,000-ton U.S. pork order, its largest since 2020, left producers with perishable stock and no fallback buyers. Meanwhile, the USTR's port fee rule threatens to compound losses by charging $1.5 million per Chinese vessel, disproportionately affecting containerized agriculture, which represents 55% of U.S. ag export value. These aren't fringe disruptions, they're structural penalties with no upside for the very farmers tariffs are supposed to protect. The price of food is soaring, but farmers aren't reaping the benefits. While Cal-Maine Foods posted over $1 billion in profits during the 2024 egg shortage, smaller producers faced feed costs up 20% due to tariffs on Canadian imports. According to Reuters, Trump's new tariff regime, some of the highest in a century, has driven up consumer food prices by nearly 18% year over year. Yet farm incomes, especially for small and mid-sized operations, are falling. This contradiction reflects a deeper issue. Pricing power is increasingly consolidated among processors and distributors, not producers. Tariffs meant to protect U.S. agriculture are instead amplifying corporate markups, while pushing independent farmers toward insolvency. U.S. food production is no longer tethered to farmer profitability. It's tied to global trade dynamics and corporate supply chains. Policies dating back to NAFTA and successive farm bills encouraged overproduction while outsourcing price stability to international buyers. That model is now collapsing. Bloomberg notes that over 40% of U.S. soy, corn, and wheat growers report they cannot break even without stable export contracts. As markets vanish and input costs spike, the cracks aren't just in trade, they're in the very system that assumed cheap land, endless growth, and permanent demand. When 68 sailings are canceled in 1 month and layoffs follow, the signal isn't just pain, it's system failure. During his first term, Trump's tariff war led to over $32 billion in farm bailouts, yet failed to resolve structural trade imbalances. Now, his return to punitive tariffs has triggered China's pivot to Brazil and Canada's 25% duty on U.S. agriculture, destroying export momentum and threatening long-term access. According to the Wall Street Journal, rural banks are reporting early signs of credit contraction, with loan defaults rising in ag-heavy counties. Instead of fostering independence, this cycle of trade war and bailout has created dependency without resilience. Trump promised leverage. What farmers got was volatility, vanishing contracts, and a shrinking customer base. Supply management, once core to New Deal-era farm policy, offered price floors, conservation incentives, and strategic reserves that stabilized incomes and food access alike. Research from the University of Missouri shows that maintaining such policies through 2020 would have cost 37% less than bailout programs while preserving export competitiveness. Paired with industrial strategy like the CHIPS Act and climate-smart subsidies, tariffs can work, but only if they're part of a coherent policy that tackles monopolies, supports infrastructure, and restores farmer autonomy. Right now, none of that exists. We're using 1930s tools with no 21st century map, and farmers are paying the price for every missed step. So, what happens when a trade war becomes a full-blown collapse of trust? Between farmers and markets, policy and promises, Washington and the people who put food on the table. That's not a hypothetical. It's happening. And while tariffs grab headlines, the real question is this. When every ship gets rerouted, every contract gets canceled, and every bailout runs dry, who's still standing in America's farm belt? Because the next move won't be about tariffs. It'll be about survival, and the clock's still ticking. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe.
Alright guys, so let's talk about cause and effect today. The US trade war is starting to backfire in just so many ways. Countries are standing firm, and as a result, a supply crisis is coming for the US. Now the main event, of course, is the struggle between Washington and Beijing, and neither side wants to give way. China is tired of the US trying to corner its economy, and for the US, the main agenda is crystal clear. US manufacturing has to come back. Besson calls it a rebalancing, and it will have to be done at China's expense.
So what we will first want to see is a de-escalation. We will likely revisit the purchase agreements that were put under together in the first China trade agreement in January of 2020 to make sure that the Chinese are honoring those agreements. Everyone knows that China needs to rebalance towards more consumption. So if we could rebalance together, then that would be the big deal. But in the meantime, we're going to bring down the unfair trade barriers and hold them to the agreements that they previously signed.
Now, Besson has two big demands for Beijing. The first is for China to remove their tariffs, which he calls a de-escalation, which to be frank is quite hilarious. Now, the second is for China to buy an additional $200 billion worth of US goods in 24 months. But I highly doubt he will get either of them. But for China, the way forward is quite clear. Apart from tariffs, you want to put more pressure on the US financial system. After all, it was the bond market imploding that forced Trump to do a tariff pause. Now, even Japan is using their holdings of US debt to remind Besson of the leverage they hold. $1 trillion in treasury bonds isn't something to sneeze at, especially when the US, they are very desperate for rates to come down. Japan dumping their pile of US debt would spike yields higher. Traditional US allies are realizing that the trade war is an existential battle for survival as well. So nothing's off the table in this struggle. And for China, this decoupling has to go much further than just trade. They still have over $700 billion worth of treasuries, which is a huge amount to hold. Besides just the risk of sanctions, the value of China's dollar holdings are getting clobbered. This is the biggest dollar dump since 2022 and more losses might be coming ahead. We are witnessing an exodus of domestic and foreign real money away from the US. For China, this is a double whammy. Now the value of your bonds has dropped by 9 to 10% if you decide to convert them back to the Chinese RMB. It easily wipes away any yield you would have gained over the years. And this will only strengthen the resolve of China to de-dollarize. It doesn't make sense to hold on to a losing position while finding your own containment. While China's deleveraging their treasuries is going to be a very slow process. Now, dumping all at once could signal financial war. It could just drive Trump crazy. Beijing is most likely going to just let their positions mature without reinvesting back into treasury bonds. But beyond just government bonds, China's holdings of other US debt is now at risk. The Trump administration is about to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, these are big mortgage giants and a ton of their bonds are held by the Chinese government. Beijing bought these instruments because they yielded more than US treasuries and there was an implicit government guarantee. But that might be going away, especially if the companies become private, which means the bonds can default without any rescue if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decides not to pay. Now, Beijing is taking their de-dollarization push more seriously, and they are beginning to do it with their riskiest assets. China's sovereign wealth fund, which manages $1.3 trillion, is starting to cut their exposure in the US private markets. They are selling away $1 billion in private equity investments in the United States, and the amount would likely snowball down the line. Private equity is a high-risk, high-reward kind of investment. But with the Trump trade war, China faces an additional issue. The US is moving to block Beijing from investing into US companies. Now, Trump is directing the Committee on Foreign Investment to restrict Chinese investments into the US. And the plan is to ring-fence key industries, including energy, agriculture, healthcare, and technology. The justification is, of course, over national security grounds. That's definitely the prerogative of the US. But let's look at things from China's point of view. Allocating capital into American companies is becoming increasingly impossible. Even if we take away the risk of confiscation, there are three big reasons why China will exit from private US companies. The situation has completely flipped today. Firstly, there's the US recession risk. Now, everyone knows GDP has contracted in Q1. The economy shrank by 0.3% in the first 3 months. And if the US falls into recession, not only will public companies get hammered, private companies could outright fail. Returns could collapse and your equity stake could go to zero. The US government can also force China to sell off their assets on national security grounds. Beijing will have to sell at fire sale prices, and the haircut could easily be 50 cents on the dollar. Finally, Beijing already has a directive to their companies not to invest in the United States. The central government could very well instruct their wealth funds to sell now before the exits are closed. Now, this sell-off could get much worse over time, especially during a Trump presidency. Now, the consequences for the US won't be good. There are many other wealth funds in the world that invest in America. And if the economy continues to sink, they might just follow China's lead. And should funding from global funds dry up, many private US companies will be in big trouble. If private equity funding collapses, these firms will have to head to the bond market at a time where lenders are already walking away from US Treasury bonds. By nature, these are high yield or risky borrowers. They will have to pay at least 4.5% more than what the US Treasury can borrow at. So if Besson issues bonds at 4% yield, private US companies will need to borrow at 8.5% or more. And this just adds more strain to their operations. And in the worst case scenario, they will default on their obligations or they'll simply go bankrupt, they go under. So there are consequences to the trade war. The US system is highly financialized, so China pulling their money out will have material effects. And remember what's coming soon, the tax cut bill. Not only will the 2017 cuts be made permanent, Trump is going to pass a sweeping bill that will add a ton of burden to the national debt.
In the coming weeks and months, we will pass the largest tax cuts in American history, and that will include no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill, and it will be the biggest bill ever passed in our country's history. It will include the biggest tax cuts, regulation cuts, military supremacy, and just about everything else.
The federal government will have to issue a ton of bonds to fund the tax cuts, and this competes with capital for private US companies as well. And the US government will always have a lower cost of borrowing, so rates across the board, they will go up. Now, Trump's tax cuts will add nearly $8 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. So expect an additional at least $500 to $700 billion more in bond issuance every single year. The tariffs won't be able to cover this. But this brings us back to China. Where are they going to invest their proceeds? Now, some will be converted to domestic stimulus, while others will be spent on BRI projects. However, Beijing will still need to stash some money in reserve assets. And if we look closely at which markets are deep enough, there's only one avenue that makes the most sense for China. US Treasuries today still make up the biggest safe haven asset market in the world. It's over $28 trillion deep. And because of that, a lot of countries store their wealth in dollar assets. Now, the second biggest haven asset is gold, coming in at $13.4 trillion last December. While it's smaller than the treasury market, it's deep enough for Beijing to invest their reserves in. Now, you combine that with zero counterparty risk, it's quite obvious what China will go for. They will dump their holdings and move more towards gold. Now, at this point, it's one of the safest assets around, especially during a trade war. There are just so many uncertainties that China will likely play defensive. And if we step back and look at China's reserves and their allocations, it further confirms the move towards gold. At the start of 2025, China owned around 2,300 tons of gold. That's the official numbers. It's a lot of bullion, but it accounts for only 6% of China's total reserves, much less than any G7 country, even Russia. So the bid for gold from China isn't going to disappear. They will keep pulling money out of the US and stash even more into gold. China could very easily bump up their gold holdings to 9 or even 10% by the end of the year. Trust in the US is simply gone at this point. But there's another signal in the market we need to talk about. It's another sign that de-dollarization isn't over and where the money is actually flowing to. Apart from money entering gold and euros, capital is flowing into Chinese investments. Now, for the first time in history, Hong Kong spent 46 billion Hong Kong dollars to buy the US currency to defend its currency peg. That's a purchase of $6 billion, the highest in just one single day. Understand what this means. The Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the USD and it's done that way for a reason. China wants to position Hong Kong as a financial hub as well as to maintain affordable exports as well. And if the currency peg breaks, it won't be good for the very purpose of Hong Kong. Now, the Hong Kong dollar has appreciated so much that their central bank had to step in to push it down. The world was selling US dollars and pushed the HKD towards the strongest end of its trading range. Now, the conclusion is quite simple. More money poured into the currency to buy Hong Kong and Chinese stocks. Investors see US equities as risky, and besides just gold, money is flowing into China, and the Hong Kong dollar is just a proxy of that capital flow. It's not a surprise that Chinese stocks won the US by over 20% this year alone. That's the highest margin since 2007. But remember back then, the US and China were still very strong trading partners. There wasn't any trade war like what we are witnessing today. Things have truly gone ballistic over the last 4 months. As a result, we are seeing a grand rotation out of US assets into Chinese assets. But here's the funny thing. This will affect US consumers more than it actually enriches Chinese investors. Now, the right chart shows us the exposure of total household wealth in the US versus China, and focus on the light blue segment that represents stocks. 31% of total wealth is in stocks for the typical American household. However, for China, it's just 10%. So falling stock prices affects US consumers much more. It's the reverse wealth effect. Now, the left chart shows us another reason why money is flowing to Chinese stocks. Bond yields in China are extremely low, so there's very little return to be had. And this makes the dividends of Chinese equities very attractive to global investors. They can now get over 3% across the board. And these are the unintended consequences of Trump's trade war. It's all fun and games until the world decides to move away from what makes the US truly exceptional. And a big part of that is Wall Street. So everything is once again tied to the trade war. And regardless of what we think should happen, Trump is still hell-bent on punishing China's economy. Despite the threat of a recession, we are still being railroaded towards total decoupling.
And I want to know what you think about that. Are you comfortable with the country potentially dipping into a recession for a period of time if you are able to achieve your long-term goals?
Well, you say some people on Wall Street say, well, I tell you something else. Some people on Wall Street say that we're going to have the greatest economy in history. Why don't you talk about them? Because some people on Wall Street say this is
well, that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at, though. It's the same question.
Yeah, there are many people on Wall Street say this is going to be the greatest windfall ever happened.
And that's my question.
Remember
the
this.
Long term. Yeah. Is it okay in the short term to have a recession?
Look, everything's okay.
And the longer this drags on, the more damage it will do to US companies. More capital could flow from the west to the east. And if China follows this up with massive amounts of stimulus, it will just draw even more money away from US markets. Bad news for the US consumer, who's going to feel even poorer. But let me know what you think. Will China continue pulling away money from US companies? And will more investment dollars...
Coffee. Follow me.